Philip Auguste was about to triumph over Bophelnic by a formidable coalition, and the throne, strengthened against foreign attacks, already commenced to enjoy the fruits of this celebrated period, when the Holy King, whose history we write, was born at Poissy 25th April. 1215 he was the son of Louis, Prince Royal of France, and Blanche of Castile. This virtuous princess, daughter of Alphonse IX, King of Castile, joined to rare beauty a prudence still more rare. In her was admired an exemplary piety, which manifested itself in unremitting zeal for the interests of religion, and a capacity uncommon to her sex, in all that concerned politics and state government. Blanche did not wish to confide to another the duty of nursing her son. She submitted with joy to this natural duty, taking every precaution to strengthen the physical constitution of the royal infant. Expecting that time would develop the faculties of his mind, after a glorious reign of 43 years, Philippe Auguste died, leaving the kingdom more flourishing and the crown more respected than it had ever been since the time of Charlemagne. His son, Louis VIII, who succeeded him, had already given such proofs of courage as to cause him to be surnamed the Lion. Called to the throne of England by the wishes of the lords and the people, disgusted by the cruelties of John Lackland, this prince had reigned a short time in Great Britain, having soon been compelled to yield the place to the son of his competitor, who was the lawful sovereign. Having become King of France, Louis VIII applied himself to pursue the course of his father and showed no less activity in the execution of his designs. During the short period of a reign of 3 years, he triumphed over the pretensions of some great vassals, who saw with chagrin that he limited the two great independence which they had enjoyed under most of the preceding kings. Conquered the English, whose possessions in France embraced several vast provinces, repulsed the Gascons, and subdued the Albigenses. It was on his return from this last war that he died at the Chateau of Montpensier in Auvergne, regretted by the people, to whom he was endeared by his brilliant qualities, 1226. When this melancholy news was communicated to the Queen, she at first indulged in the most poignant sorrow, but regaining soon the firmness natural to a great character, she thought of the interests of her eldest son, scarcely 12 years of age, and lost no time ere causing him to be crowned. It is he who is now about to reign under the name of Louis IX. The late king, by the arrangement of his affair, had left the regency to the Queen. The latter feared not to undertake a burden so painful under the circumstances in which she was placed. All the nobles of the kingdom were commanded by her to assist at the coronation of the young king, but the greater part excused themselves under different pretexts. The Count of Boulogne, uncle of the monarch, the Duke of Bourgogne, the Counts Autry, the Counts Autio, of Blois, and the 3 brothers of Coucy alone attended. The Countesses of Flanders and of Champagne were present also, and each, on account of the absence of her husband, claimed the honorable prerogative of bearing the sword on that occasion. To put an end to this singular contest, it was necessary to yield this right, which belonged to the most ancient nobles of the kingdom, to the Count Haut Boulogne. From this moment they were enabled to form an idea of what they might expect from a prince whom God had gifted with such ardent piety. The idea of pronouncing a solemn oath, of which, notwithstanding his youth, he felt the importance, inspired him with fear. At the moment of his coronation, he exclaimed, "Like the holy King David, my God, I have raised my soul to you, and in you I have put my trust." In the meantime, Thibaut, Count of Champagne, was returning to assist at the ceremony of the coronation, but on account of some grievous charges which preceded him, Thibaut forbade him to continue his journey. The barons represented him that if he attempted to raise new fortifications as his palace, the kingdom would rise against him. Thibaut, irritated by this affront, thought only of revenge, and from that time entered into a stricter alliance than ever, with the Counts of Bretagne and of Manche spirits as haughty as himself, and who, since the reign of Louis VIII, had formed a league against both, the present and future generations. These 3 lords, so powerful in themselves, drew to them a crowd of followers, who for slight causes indulged in discontent against the court, and endeavored to increase the disorders so as to profit by them. This dissension was excited by the King of England, who was anxious to regain Normandy and some other provinces that Philippe Auguste had added to the crown. As for the other factionists, they had apparently no determined end in view, at least they had disclosed none. The only pretext which they alleged for their rebellion was the refusal of the regent to restore the lands that had been seized or confiscated during the 2 preceding reigns. On this refusal, they took up arms and openly commenced hostilities. The number and strength of this multitudinous army could not daunt the soul of the regent. This princess, endowed with a great and penetrating mind, and an indefatigable activity, expected by this startling revolt to gain followers and make friends for the king her son. The Count of Boulogne, the uncle of Louis, was of great assistance to the cause which he embraced. Several concessions were made him which reflected but little credit him liberty on the most lenient terms. After having made necessary arrangements with the promptitude that the case required, this princess placed herself with her son at the head of a powerful army and looked the route to Champagne. The Cardinal of Saint-Ange, legate of the Pope, the Counts of Boulogne and Dreux, accompanied the king. The inclemency of the season, it being winter, rendered an enterprise of this nature doubtful. The Count of Champagne, stunned at so unexpected an attack, hastened to the king, cast himself at his feet, and implored his clemency. Louis, either from a natural nobleness of spirit, or through the counsel of his mother, received him favorably, and pardoned him with a grace that heightened the favor bestowed. Thibaut, touched by his generosity, arose and swore eternal fidelity at all hazards. Thus terminated, without effusion of blood, a campaign, the result of which might have periled the monarch on his throne, if time had been allowed to strengthen the rebellion. The success of this expedition determined the queen to hasten towards Loire, to engage in a combat against the Britons. The Counts of Bretagne and of Marche at first acted on the defensive and refused to submit to other judgment, the royal army having advanced as far as Loudun. These two counts did not think it their duty to test arms and presented themselves monarch, who granted them peace, on conditions no means rigorous. The Duke O'Guienne remained with his English troops, and with the famous Savary de Mauleon, who had caused many of the nobles of Poitou to flock to his standard. The king sent against them his troops, who defeated them and compelled them to retire to their own dominions. Shortly after, by agreement, they entered into a truce of 1 year's duration. Peace appeared now to be re-established in every portion of the kingdom. The spirit of faction, however, pervaded France and soon manifested itself. In order to quell it, it was necessary to have recourse to other and more severe measures. The young king, on his return to Paris, left soon after the issue of his followers for Orleans. The malcontents of Coast's designs had been frustrated, thought the occasion favorable, and scrupled not to use perfidious means to accomplish their designs. The plans for the seizure of the monarch were so well formed that the success of their disloyal enterprise appeared to admit of no doubt, but God, who watched over this exemplary king, permitted not the accomplishment of their dark designs. Information was given to Louis sufficiently early for him to seek an asylum, from whence he demanded assistance. On hearing of the danger with which the king was menaced, the Parisians armed themselves and flocked in crowds to defend him. The nobility and bourgeois swelled the number of his faithful partisans. In a few hours, the Nandide, which separated the capital from the place in which the king had taken refuge, was crowded, and so great was the number of armed men that Louis passed among them as he would have done through the files of his guard. Joyous acclamations rent the air. He was loaded by DHS people with benedictions. The clergy and those PI evented by age oath the stern necessities of life, petitioned God to grant their young prince life and prosperity and shield him from his enemies. Whilst the nation thus loudly manifested its devotion to its king, the rebels, mortified by the disastrous termination of their enterprise, withdrew to their different provinces, there to shelter themselves from pursuit, which they had every reason to expect. But this once, the clemency of the monarch left their audacity unpunished, without, however, being able to overcome their ill will. The tranquility which followed this event gave to the queen leisure to occupy herself almost exclusively with the education of her son. Her first care was that he should be surrounded by those men of the kingdom whose science and virtue alike recommended them. The progress of Louis was worthy of such tender solicitude. His natural disposition, joined to constant application and above all an admirable docility, lessened the principal difficulties of study. The respect which he entertained for his mother caused him to experience pleasure, whilst adorning his mind with virtue and ascending the hill of science. Approbation formed his chief delight. Poring over historic pages was his favorite amusement. It is this that forms kings, that teaches them to distinguish the language of truth from that of base flattery, and enables them to avoid the numerous quicksands by which they are surrounded. He studied Latin with success sufficient to explain the writings of the Holy Fathers. These were found at that time only in hands of the learned. A Latin letter of his is no excat written to the Queen, his mother, during his voyage to Palestine. While skillful masters labored diligently to enrich the mind of the young king, with useful knowledge, his virtuous mother endeavored to instill into his heart the principles of religion which seemed to have had already birth. Of what value are not the precepts of a mother when accompanied by such constant example? The Queen, his mother, often remarked to him, "My son, God knows how dear you are to me, but rather than see your soul stained by one mortal sin, I would prefer to see you fall dead at my feet." Never was this beautiful lesson effaced from the memory of the saintly king, and none could doubt but that he owed to these sentiments of purest piety all those virtues which elevated him, not only above all kings but also above all men. It was in this manner that the pious queen showed herself worthy of the confidence with which her august spouse had invested her. The enemies of Blanche, jealous that a stranger should exercise supreme authority, sought to blacken her character by the most atrocious calumnies. Unfortunately, Tini succeeded in gaining to their party T.S. Count of Boulogne, son of Philip Auguste and uncle F. the present king, who would have had an incontestable right to the regency if Blanche had not been appointed by Louis VIII. The regret that he experienced in not being able to wield the scepter determined him to listen to the suggestions of the conspirators. Without entering, at first, into their project of aggression, he contented himself with strengthening high fortresses, and particularly that of Calais, which from a small village became, by its situation, a commodious port and important city. In a council held at Corbeil, the chief of the conspirators agreed that the Count of Bretagne should first raise the standard of revolt, that the king at this news would rally all around him, that they should all flock to him, not to defend the place, but to enable the troops of Bretagne more readily to secure his person. No sooner had this feat been communicated to the Count of Champagne, who assisted at this council, than he revealed all to the king, and with 300 chevaliers hastened to his assistance. The treason by this means was baffled, and the Count of Bretagne, surprised at the moment when he least expected it, was compelled to throw himself on the clemency of the king, who deigned to pardon him. This unexpected termination of an enterprise, whose success appeared certain, exasperated the conspirators against Thibaut, who had twice frustrated their project by his defection. They had first resolved to avenge themselves, but hoping to regain him as an auxiliary, they had recourse to another stratagem to detach him from the service of the HS king, whose retainers were but limited. Thibaut, still young, was a widower. Blessed with an only daughter, the Count of Bretagne proposed an alliance between my daughter and Thibaut, thinking by this means to attach him more firmly to his league. The offer was accepted. The wedding day appointed, Thibaut departed for the Abbey of Vie Secret. Here an interview was to take place. Scarcely had he commenced his journey than the following letter from the king, his sire, reached him. Count Thibaut of Champagne, I have heard that you contemplated an alliance with the House of Bretagne, nevertheless. Write saying that though dear the daughter o Bretagne, the interests of France forbid such an alliance. With the reasons you are acquainted in the Count, France finds her greatest enemy. Obedient to this order, Thibaut returned, revoked his promise, excused himself to the Count of Bretagne, then visited Chateau Thierry, where a short time after he espoused Margaret de Bourbon. The rage of the conspirators on hearing this Anod Ba expressed. All had assembled at Vie Secret. Under the pretext of assisting at the nuptials, their real design was open rebellion. The only thought was to punish him who had violated his word. Their first act was to make the Queen of Chypre his enemy, who might be considered as the rightful heir to the province of Champagne. The Count of Boulogne, who until this time had taken no part in the dispute, loudly declaimed against Thibaut, accusing him of having poisoned the late king. Historians regard for this as an odious imputation without the least foundation. Be this as it may, the Count of Boulogne, idolized by Theotigen, increased the number of the Malutento by his influence over the nobles, who until then had been fidifui the king. As soon as they had united their troops, they fell with impetuosity on Champagne, burning and laying waste this unfortunate country. The hatred which animated the chiefs communicated itself to the subalterns and left the latter full liberty to indulge in the most frightful excesses. It is impossible to relate the cruelties practiced during this expedition. Thibaut could not resist his numerous enemies, and was compelled to raze to the ground several fortresses in order to retrench their supplies. The king could not remain a tranquil spectator of the ruin of one of his vassals, especially when the real cause of so much bloodshed was the fidelity which he showed to his sovereign. Consequently, he commanded the malcontents to throw down their arms, and foreseeing the refusal, he marched at the head of his troops to see that they obeyed his commands. Thibaut joined him with all the troops he could raise, and the Duke of Lorraine hastened to enlist under the royal standard. The regent reiterated the order. Alliadi announced to the rebels to evacuate Champagne. They insolently replied that they would see justice done and not leave it to a woman whose authority had been acquired by the murder of her husband. The royal army now advanced against them. The moment was decisive. The united princes hesitated in the course which they had intended to pursue afterwards, to reconcile their vengeance with the respect which they entertained for the arms. They said to the king that they would engage in the combat between the Duke of Lorraine and the Count of Champagne, though their troops numbered some 300 lees. Louis, then displaying that noble pride which is so becoming to a king of France, replied that he could not witness a combat between his subjects, and that the rebel must either engage in the battle offered them, or immediately quit the domains of the Count. So much firmness in one so young astonished the nobles. They deputed new messengers to the king to say that they would prevail upon the Queen of Chai, to relinquish her claims. The young monarch coldly replied that he would dispense with their services. To no proposal of peace will I listen, added he, neither will I suffer Thibaut to listen to any, even if by so doing Champagne should be delivered from the troops who are now laying it waste. The Confederates, no longer hoping to change his magnanimous resolution, and commencing to dread the consequences which might arise from this revolt, retreated to a short distance. The king pursued them, driving them before him, until they reached the earldom of Nevers, at which place they dispersed. Having delivered his vassal from an unjust oppression, the young king, guided by the counsels of his mother, thought of terminating the difference between Thibaut and the Queen of Chipre. The latter supported her claims by right of birth, being the daughter of the last Count of Champagne. Thibaut was only nephew, but the throne had been bequeathed to him. After much negotiating, it was agreed that the queen should renounce all pretensions, receiving a considerable pecuniary indemnity, he being unable to pay the sum agreed on. The king undertook it, and Thibaut ceded to the crown the earldoms of Blois, Chartres, Sancerre, and Châteaudun with their dependencies. The king had scarcely returned to the capital when a rebellion broke out among the students of the university. Nearly all were engaged in it, and their arrogance increased by the numerous privileges granted by the kings to this flourishing establishment. A private quarrel had given rise to this revolt. 2 years, and the intervention of great authority were necessary to cause the obstinate to return to their duty. Their high opinion of their own talents had, no doubt, inspired them with exaggerated ideas of independence. They were engaged in settling this disgraceful affair when they were compelled to march against Mauclair, Count of Bretagne, who in concert with Guyenne had invaded the territories of the French, everywhere spreading terror and desolation. The queen assembled the nobility and the bourgeois, whilst Parliament proceeded to act juridically against the rebel prince. The king advanced at the head of his army, though in the midst of an inclement season. The first operation was the siege of Belesme, a place considered impregnable, and in which the Count of Bretagne had placed the elite of his troops. The royal army suffered much from cold. Already had several soldiers perished for want of fuel, when the queen, who supported the fatigues of this war with admirable constancy, caused proclamation to be made that large rewards would be given to those bringing wood to the quarters of the besieged. So great was the quantity brought, that the army, having only to struggle against an enemy that had equalled in courage, succeeded in overthrowing, by means of machines, those fortresses considered impregnable, and the garrison, reduced to extremity, was obliged to capitulate. Soon after, the Duke of Gouvernet, who was confident of victory, retired with his troops, complaining that the Count of Bretagne had deceived him by his reports. The latter, abandoned by his English allies, submitted again to the king, took new oaths which the monarch feigned to believe, not being sufficiently sure of the assistance of other barons to push matters further. The happy success of an expedition conducted by the king in person served to encourage those who had remained faithful, and to warn the enemies of the king to put limit to their undertakings. This first victory was followed by another more brilliant, and the effects of which proven more advantageous to the crown. The last 2 reigns had been troubled by the War of the Albigenses. The conquest of Louis VIII in Languedoc seemed to have terminated it, but the death of that prince and the broils in the kingdom during the minority of his successor enabled the heretics to repair a portion of their losses. Raymond, Count Old Toulouse, who commanded them, attacked the troops that the late king had left in the southern provinces. They fought on both sides with a ferocity equal to that exhibited advantages were gained by the soldiers of Raymond. At this time, a crusade against the heretics was contemplated, but i.e. wisdom of the king and regent, obtained by negotiation what 20 years of war had not been able to effect the entire submission of the counts of Toulouse and of Foix, the re-establishment of peace, and the triumph owed to religion in the provinces. By the marriage of Jeanne, daughter of Raymond, with Alphonse, brother of the young king, the party owed the Count of Toulouse was more nearly allied with the royal house, and consequently the domain of the crown was increased. All admired the skill of the queen, and attached themselves more firmly to a prince who had so well profited by her instructions. The Count of Bretagne still remained obstinate, notwithstanding the small success of his treasons. Abandoned by the French barons, he once more had recourse to Henry, King of England, to whom he rendered homage as to his sovereign, and obtained from him magnificent promises. Louis was at Saumur when he received an insolent letter from the Count which decided him to march immediately against this rebel. The royal army had already taken Angers and several other places, when the vassals of the crown, who according to the law of tenure, were only compelled to serve 40 days, declared that their term had expired and that the king must consent for them to return to their homes. The Counts of Flanders and Champagne alone evinced loyal positions, but fearing an attack on their own domains they begged leave of absence. The disbanded troop, instead of retiring peaceably, attacked and pillaged Champagne. Gone, they learned that the English monarch was about to embark for Bretagne with a considerable army. At this news, Louis again assembled his nobility and prepared to seize Ancinous, Udon, and Chantosso. During this time, Henry, who appeared to have visited France only to assist at a grand fete, gave himself up to unbounded hilarity. Balls, festivals, and plays succeeded each other during the day. The English troops, following his example, indulged themselves in the most shameful debauches. Such disorders were sufficient to destroy an army, whose number would have enabled it to conquer a kingdom. Louis judged that, as the enemy seemed desirous of ruining themselves, he would allow them to do so without shedding blood uselessly. Consequently, he left on the frontiers Bretagne troops sufficient to contend with the English. Combat should become necessary. He returned with high court to Compiègne, where he occupied himself in settling the differences between the principal nobles of the kingdom, and succeeded in effecting a general reconciliation. After so many civil wars, France revived. Louis, to whom his mother had abandoned a portion of her authority, though he was still a minor, devoted himself entirely to the promotion of happiness among his people. This young monarch, occupied in so paternal a duty, deprived himself even of those amusements which were allowed him. In order to ensure tranquility to his kingdom, he fortified, alternately banished and recalled, accumulated much of the wealth of the nation. The king, to put an end to these extortions, forbade the Jews to loan money for a longer period than 3 years, and declared those debts that should not be attended to during this period to be null. At the same time, this holy monarch caused all the barons to take an oath to lend no assistance to those who should violate this decree. Whilst Louis delivered his people from the scourge, which for so long a time had devoured their substance, he consecrated a portion of his time and immense wealth to works of piety. He furnished the Abbey of St. Denis with means to rebuild its church, and founded himself the celebrated Abbey of Royaumont in Beauvoisis. It is said that on this last he worked in his leisure moments, and that he even assisted in carrying stones and cultivating the garden. However this may be, it was for him a peaceful retreat, where he went to adore God in silence, serve the poor, and recreate himself after his fatiguing exertions age-governing. Under the management of the regent, all things prospered, and already she reaped the fruits of her care. Louis, wise, pious, and courageous, was now of an age when the interests of France required that he should seek an alliance with some noble house. Blanche regarded favorably Marguerite, daughter of Raymond Béranger, Count of Provence. This young princess was endowed with extraordinary charms, a brilliant mind, goodness, wisdom, and modesty, which endeared her to the provincials. The troubadours wng unceasingly of the virtues of Marguerite. The Count received with respect and gratitude he proposals made to him in the name of the king, and soon a young queen, worthy of the affection of her spouse, added a new charm to the court. 1233. Scarcely had the feats occasioned by this marriage terminated before war was again announced. The truce concluded 3 years before with England, and the Count of Bretagne was nearly terminated. The latter had already made some incursions on the lands of the allies of the king. They thought seriously of punishing his temerity. After a short delay, Louis entered Bretagne at the head of a powerful army, and such was the rapidity of his march that the count, to whom the English were but of little assistance, was compelled to submit to conditions, which henceforth deprived him of nearly all power of attempting another revolt. This submission was one of the last events of any importance that characterized the regency. The king was no longer a minor, though for several years he was guided by his mother in the management of his affairs. The fetter during her life reigned under the name of her son and in concert with him. The good of the kingdom was the only object of both, thus harmony prevailed. After his majority, Louis was compelled to treat harshly Oé, who had formerly served him faithfully. Thibaut, Count of Champagne, had inherited the throne of Navarre, and either because of this new title he thought Art himself dispensed from those obligations, which as a vassal he owed his king, or his rebellious dispositions having returned, because more wealthy and powerful than ever. He violated the treaty, allied his daughter to the eldest son of the Count of Bretagne, whose fidelity was suspected by the barons. This affair was conducted so secretly that King was in ignorance of it until the marriage had taken place. It would have been much to his interest to have prevented this union. Not being able to remedy it, Lewin required Thibaut to give up 3 of his towns. In Oé had been the first to propose this alliance, which had been formed without the knowledge of the king. The haughty vassal, instead of replying to this summons, prepared for war and fortified his principal cities. But soon he was constrained to yield to royal power and to purchase peace by renouncing the tenures of Montereau-Fontenay and Bray-sur-Seine. The king, moreover, obliged him to undertake a voyage to Palestine and forbade him to appear in France for 7 years. Shortly after, the Holy King was exposed to a danger from which he was manifestly delivered by the hand of God. A vague report had spread in Tne east of a pretended expedition needed by this prince. At that time there existed in the mountains of Persia, and in those of Syria, a sect of fanatics who, under the title of Islamites, professed a species of Mahometism and lived in a state of continual hostilities with all nations. They were called assassins, from the Arabic word hassasizan, which signifies slayer, because they thought themselves obliged to kill all those who had the misfortune to displease their chief. The latter reigned so despotically over his subjects that if so disposed, he could deprive them both of property and life. He often made use of this prerogative to rid himself of those neighboring princes whose views conflicted with his own. As soon as he manifested a desire to destroy one of them, he found docile instruments ready to execute his orders. They set out disguised to the residence of their victim and awaited a favorable occasion to assassinate him, but had they failed, they would have still been unembarrassed. If they perished in the struggle, they were replaced by others, animated with like ferocity and a similar contempt for life. The chief of these assassins, hearing that the king contemplated an attack, dispatched 2 of his subjects to deliver him from an enemy, whose reputation had reached the interior of the East. The assassins had no sooner departed than the chief, animated by a humane sentiment, sent deputies to the king to warn him of the peril with which he was menaced. Louis loaded the envoys with presents, redoubled his fervor and piety, referring to God alone. His miraculous escape. An occasion soon offered itself for displaying his piety. Necessity compelled the emperors of Constantinople to deliver to the Venetians the holy crown of thorns of our Lord in payment of a large sum which they owed. The Emperor Baudouin, before delivering up this precious relic, offered it to the king, who hastened to obtain it by paying the sum due the Venetians. It was conveyed to Paris and received with much pomp. Within the enclosure of his palace, the king caused to be erected the Holy Chapel, in which the Holy Crown was exposed in a magnificent case, 1238. At the same time, Louis directed his attention to the alliances contracted by the nobles. He knew the influence that marriages contracted with foreigners would exert on lords, already so powerful. He opposed with firmness the marriage of Jean of Ponthion with the King of England, and that of the widow of the Count of Boulogne with the Count of Boulogne with the Count of Leicester. However, he rewarded these 2 princesses by alliances no less honorable, but more conformable to the interests of the kingdom. His attention was then directed to the affairs of his 2 brothers, Robert and Alphonse. The former, invested with the title of Comte d'Artois, espoused Matilda, sister of the Duke of Brabant. The latter was united to the daughter of the Count of Toulouse, to whom he had been affianced since his 9th year. On this occasion the king displayed royal magnificence, but was soon surpassed by the pomp and splendor of the fetes, which took place when the order of knighthood was conferred on his brothers. They were A's Joinville, feats without parallel. These festivals consisted principally of tilts, jousts, and tournaments. The year following, new troubles in Languedoc made the king's presence necessary. He repaired thither at the beat of an army, and easily succeeded in restoring peace. That which mostly contributed to maintain it was the resolution that many of the nobles had taken to attempt the conquest of Palestine. The moment was favorable. The Saracens had not sufficient troops to defend themselves from the frightful multitude of Tartars that menaced the whole of the East. On this occasion was seen Debier, King of Navarre and Count of Champagne, Peter Mauclair, John of Dreux, his brother Hugh, Duke of Bourgogne Henry, Count of Bar Robert of Courtenay, Ganthier of Brienne, Amaury of Montfort, High Constable of France, who represented the king. Louis beheld with pleasure the departure of the greater number of these barons who had caused so many dissensions, unembarrassed by the disquietude which their ambition still caused him. He devoted himself entirely and promote the welfare of his subjects. This was the only feud of this expedition. The disunion which prevailed among the Crusades prevented them from gaining any lasting advantage. Owing to the mismanagement of this enterprise, the greater number lost their lives and liberty. The remainder returned to France in a deplorable condition. The new empire of Constantinople, founded by the Count of Flanders, was in a state of defense against the attacks of the Greeks, Turks, and Bulgarians. Baudouin I, who then reigned under the tutelage of the brave John of Arfrienne, came to France to solicit aid, and was welcomed by the king with the courtesy due an unfortunate prince. The greater number of the lords, forgetful of the unfortunate termination of the First Crusade, hastened to raise the Holy Cross as the standard. In a short space of time, Baudouin was placed at the head of a considerable army. Obstructions placed in his way by the Emperor Frederick II diminished, it is true, the number of crusaders, but those that remained were sufficient to establish the young king on his throne, at least for the present. Whilst the East was the theater of continual war, the Western Empire was far from enjoying tranquility. The dissensions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines desolated Italy and Germany. Each of the two parties had endeavored to attach the king to its interests, but the wisdom of the latter enabled him to avoid such shipwreck, and he remained neutral. Soon after, the king withdrew to Saumur to hold a plenary court and assembly which was held by the great in former times. These assemblies differed from those that were generally held in March or May. The object of the latter was to investigate the state of public affairs, whilst the former, in reality, were only brilliant feats, where the kings repaired, adorned with all the pomp of majesty. The Prince de Joinville, who in his Life of Saint Louis has given a description of this assembly, assures us that it was he most brilliant that had taken place in his time. The accustomed ceremonies being over, the king, who did no wish uselessly to prolong the expenses of those who accompanied him, took leave of all, with the exception of his household officers, with whom he went to Poitiers to reinstate his brother, Prince Alphonse. All the vassals of the new count surrounded him to render him homage. Among them was Hugh, Count of Marche. This lord, who had formerly taken part in the rebellion of the nobles, came to Poitiers with the intention of creating a sensation by refusing the homage due Alphonse. The pride inspired by the position of his ancestry, that numbered the king's Haut-Prix in Jerusalem. He was chief of the oldest house of Lusignan, and still more the evil counsel of the wicked Countess Isabel, his wife, widow of John Lackland, caused him to consider as an insupportable humiliation the ceremony in which as vassal he was compelled to take part. The presence of his sovereign laid some restraint on this restless and turbulent spirit. He submitted like the rest, though he had scarcely taken the oath of fidelity. Then he hastened to assemble his friends and vassals, then encamped at 6 leagues' distance from Poitiers. The king saw himself without any other army than his household and that of his brother. In the embarrassment in which this unexpected revolt placed him, Louis for some time was uncertain as to the course which he should pursue. He sought the Count and Countess of Marche, spoke to them as their master, intimidated them so much by the boldness of his countenance that they dared attempt nothing against his person, concluded a treaty, after which the king returned to Paris. He had scarcely reached that place when he received information of a new rebellion raised by the Count of Marche. This proud vassal, profiting by the absence of the king, had sought to excite the noblesse of Poitou. The young Count of Poitiers, who had remained in his dominions to observe the conduct of Lusignan, summoned Hugh to come and renew his allegiance at the feast of Christmas. The latter, according to command, repaired to Poitiers, but only for the purpose of declaring to the count that he neither recognized him as his lord or the king as his sovereign. After this insult, he left the palace, set fire to the house that he had occupied, and I turned home without any person daring to arrest him. Louis, informed of all that had passed at Poitiers, assembled his barons, who unanimously declared that the vassal, as a rebel to his king, had forfeited his tenures. Consequently, in concert with the king, they decided that you, who had so often abused the royal clemency, should be punished. The Count of March acted on the defensive, renewed his alliance with the kings of England and Aragon, as well as with the Count of Toulouse. The first of these monarchs, son of the Countess of March, thought himself obliged to sustain the interests of his grandfather, and moreover hoped to regain those fine provinces that Philippe Auguste had ceded to the English, notwithstanding the opposition of his parliament. And the refusal of the nobility to assist him in his enterprise, he set out for Poitiers with a nombre of chevaliers, but with a considerable sum of money. Louis, after having provided for the safety of his slates, departed for Chino, which had been appointed as the rendezvous. There he found 4,000 chevaliers with their followers, 20,000 cavalry, and a considerable number of foot soldiers. The king entered the dominions of the Count of March at the head of these troops, and in a short time gained several strongholds. The rebels, unprepared for so impetuous an attack, were unable to defend the country. Compelled to fly at the approach of the royal army, they themselves laid waste the province, burning the provisions and poisoning the springs, in hopes of soon arresting the march of the enemy. The Countess Isabella, a haughty and vindictive woman who influenced the mind of her husband and emboldened him in crime, saw no other means of arresting the fall of her house than that of shortening the days of the king. A poison, prepared by her own hands, was given to those rogues who had been accustomed to perform these execrable missions. They introduced themselves in the kitchens, where the dishes for the king's table were prepared, but their strange countenances exciting suspicion. They were arrested, convicted of their atrocious design, and condemned to death. Delivered from this peril by a manifest interposition of divine providence, Louis thought of instantly attaching an enemy so undeserving of regard. The siege was raised before Fontenoy, whose inhabitants protected one of the sons of the Count of March. This fortress, being the principal hope of the rebels, was defended by the nest of their warriors. The combat was long and obstinate. The son of the Count of March commanded, and showed himself determined to be buried beneath its ruins, rather than surrender. The king then resolved to give battle. All the troops, sharing the ardor of their master, advanced with impetuosity on the ramparts of the enemy. In a few moments the royal standard floated on the breeze. The army, in the first transport of a victory so long disputed, demanded the death of the prisoners, among whom was the son of the count. The king, as generous after success as terrible in combat, opposed this rigorous act. These are, said he to his soldiers, a son and vassals, who have fulfilled the commands of a father and sovereign. They have combated as brave men, and do not merit such cruel treatment. He contented himself with retaining them as prisoners. After this exploit, Louis had only to present himself before the other places, situated on this side of the Charente, to gain the submission of the inhabitants. Taillebourg, situated on the border of this river, opened its gates, though the English army was encamped on the other side. The Charente, a small stream but exceedingly deep in this place, separated the two armies, that could not meet without crossing a small stone bridge, where but 4 men you'd pass abreast. The extremity of the BNDG was defended by towers, and the English imagined themselves secure. Nevertheless, it was there the king decided to commence the attack meditated against the English army. The first troops that attempted the passage were successful, and succeeded in driving the enemy from their entrenchments, but soon compelled in their turn to fall back. They returned, spreading terror and confusion in the army. Louis, abandoning himself to divine protection, dismounted, threw himself in the midst of the crowd, and proceeded almost alone to the extremity of the bridge, slaying all those that dared oppose his progress. Some few faithful followers, attending him, tamed themselves at his side. But, says Joinville, for every man that he had when he crossed, the English had more than 100 intrepid, but calm in so great peril. The holy king repulsed the numerous enemies that surrounded him, astonished them by his courage, and thus allowed his troops sufficient time to join him. Soon he gained the ascendancy. The English, driven back, in their turn, in vain endeavored to defend themselves. Terror reigned among them, and already had many sought safety in flight. Richard, brother of the King of England, then advanced towards the French alone. And with only a stick in his hand, he asked to speak with the king and solicited of him a suspension of arms until the next day. Louis, who by report had learned the merit of this prince and had heard of his exploits in the East, loaded him with cuirasses and granted him the delay which would have been efficient to have saved the English army had not the monarch fled, and hit Warriora followed his example. They only stopped at their arrival at Saintes, thinking that the French still pursued them, while the King of England and the Count of Marche, who had joined each other in the city, mutually reproached each other for the result of this battle. Louis, with the remainder of his army, had passed the bridge of Taillebourg and encamped in the same place the English had left. The next day he sent a foraging party as far as the walls of Saintes. At this sight Hugh, beside himself with anger, marched out with 3 of his sons, and a considerable number of Gascons and English. The French detachment, though greatly inferior in number, defended itself valiantly until the arrival of the Count of Bourgogne, who came to their assistance with the vanguard. The 2 kings, having been informed that this simple skirmish had become a serious engagement, advanced at the head of their troops. The carnage became dreadful between the conquerors of yesterday, who had to sustain a recently acquired glory, and the vanquished who wished to repair their defeat. The advantage was for a long time disputed, but the French monarch was at length victorious. He overthrew the army of the enemy and placed them in the most frightful disorder. King Henry, rendered desperate by so great a misfortune, placed his safety in flight and hastened to shut himself up in the fortress of Blaye. The troops, seized with terror, fled like their sovereign. As they were crowded on the route, the infantry threw down their arm and abandoned their baggage. Lr. The meantime, Louis took possession of Saint-H, was warmly welcomed by the clergy, nobility, and people. The principal lords of the environs hastened to render their homage to him. Among them was the brave Berthold, Lord of Mirabeau, who, having no hope of receiving assistance in the place he had defended, would not consent to surrender until his sovereign had freed him from his oath of fidelity. Abandoned by his allies and his own vassals, the Count of Marche had no other alternative than that of having recourse to the clemency of the King of France, which he had so many times abused. The eldest of his sons came to solicit the pardon of his family. He obtained it, but on conditions so rigorous and 9 take from the rebels all desire of forming new plots. By this treaty, Hugh of Lusignan, Isabelle, his wife Hugh Le Brun, Guy and Geoffroy of Lusignan, his son, submitted without restriction to the wife of the king. They ceded to the Count of Poitiers all places conquered in this campaign, moreover, the country of Aunis and several other fiefs. They renounced the annual payment of 500 livres, paid them by the king in virtue of the Treaty of Vendôme. The Count of Marche acknowledged himself as liege man of the Hainaut France and swore fidelity and assistance. The happy termination of this war permitted the king to attend to the Count of Toulouse, who had formed a powerful league in the south of France to sustain Taz of Lusignan. By a coincidence worthy of remark, Louis Lad sent with a part of his army to punish the rebel vassal. These 2 lords fulfilled their mission with so much zeal as to compel Raymond to submit. By this means, the King of England, who had expected a general revolt in his favor, saw himself entirely abandoned. Those Frenchmen upon whose assistance he had relied, he also desired to make some levies in Guyenne which still belonged to him. The Gascons received the money offered, but would furnish no troops. Henry was compelled to ask for a truce and offered 5,000 livres sterling for the expenses of the war. This offer might have been refused and the English driven from their French posses Sions, but the royal army was itself in a dreadful condition. Hunger, thirst, and contagious disease had already killed more than 20,000 men of all classes. The king was attacked by the disease which destroyed so many of his troops, and his life was even despaired of. Prudence, therefore, caused him to accept the proposals made by the English monarch. The truce was granted, and all the English nobility, reduced to the last extremity by the expenses of this campaign, hastened to quit the places that had witnessed their overthrow. The Count of Bretagne, feigning to be ignorant of the truce, lined the harbor with his vessels. The English nobles solicited and obtained passports to proceed to Calais, from which place they were to embark. In this passage they often served as a butt to the railleries of the people, some courtiers wishing to introduce Henry and their pleasantries. The king reprimanded them in a severe tone. "It will not do," said he, "to tarnish the king. My brother, with a pretext for hating me, his dignity, too, requires that he should be spoken of with respect. We must hope that the good which he has done will free him from this unpleasant situation, in which he has been placed by the impudent counsels of these villains. The generosity of Louis was without limits. It was through his care that the King of England was enabled to cross the sea and return to his own dominions, where, instead of displaying laurels, he presented a sad spectacle of misery. It was thus that the Holy King, almost alone in the midst of his enemies, succeeded by his intrepidity and the wisdom of his measures, in triumphing over a league formed by the most powerful vassals of his state, ostensibly sustained by the kings of England and Navarre, fomented secretly by those of Castile and Aragon, counseled by the Emperor Frederick, who was under many obligations to the king against whom he conspired. To heighten the public joy, excited by so great success, heaven deigned to grant a son to this pious monarch, so visibly protected by divine providence. Public joy was also augmented by the return of the king to the capital. Peace being re-established, this prince attended only to the reformation of morals and the correction of abuses. But a disease similar to that which he had the preceding year in Poitou nearly deprived him of life. From the first Ho understood the extent of the danger with which his life was menaced, without waiting to be informed of Bajudge. Having received in the most edifying manner the holy sacrament of TBU Church, this great monarch turned his attention to the principal affairs of his kingdom. He then summoned his domestics, thanked them for their past services, and counseled them to serve his successor with the same zeal, but, above all, to remain faithful to the law of God, who was their first master. Fatigue, inseparable from such important duties, exhausted the strength of the king. He suddenly lost all consciousness and fell back in profound lethargy. It was then we would have been enabled to judge of the love of the French for a prince so worthy to govern. Whilst the great men of the kingdom and the principal of the clergy hastened in crowds to the monarch, who was at Padouise, the inhabitants of the cities and country ceased not to supplicate heaven to preserve a life so precious. Consternation reigned in the palace, when after violent convulsions the body of the monarch became cold. All thought he had ceased to exist. Their tears and lamentations were succeeded by a kind of stupor. The two queens were borne fainting from the apartment. God, touched, no doubt, by the affliction of the people, manifested his goodness and infinite power. The dying king opened his eyelids, extended his arms, and distinctly pronounced these words: "The light of the east extends from the height of heaven to me by the grace of God, and has recalled me from among the dead." He then summoned the Bishop of Paris and asked for the cross by which to make a vow to go to the relief of the Holy Land. The prelate did not conceal from him the difficulties of such an engagement, but Louis insisted in a tone that would not allow him to deter the accomplishment of his desire. The cross was given him, which he kissed with respect, assuring those around him that he was healed. From this instant his malady daily decreased, and a month had scarcely passed. Then he felt stronger and better than he had done for several years. Their joy on his recovery was as lively as their sorrow had been, and the transports of which he was the object were sufficient recompense for all that he had done for the public happiness. In the midst of the general excitement, the king forgot not the sacred engagement that he had entered into. Important affairs delayed its execution, but he remained unchanged in his resolution. When Louis commenced preparations for this voyage beyond the sea, he had to struggle against the representations of several of his counsellors, and above all, against those of a mother whom he tenderly cherished, and who seemed to have a presentiment that she would never see him more. They insisted that it was easy for him to release himself from a vow taken at a moment when he was not entirely conscious. "If you relieve this," replied he to the Bishop of Barras, "behold my cross, I give it to you, but if I have any influence over you, and you bear me any friendship, you will restore it to me. You cannot doubt, but at that time I was sufficiently conscious to contract an engagement. I declare unto you that I will take no nourishment, until I am adorned with this precious mark of the troops of God." On seeing his resolution, none dared reply, and each one, persuaded that such a design could only proceed from God, thought only of seconding the execution. A prelate, sent to preach the crusade, traversed the kingdom. Many, acquainted with the vow of the king, followed his example, and some disposed of and mortgaged their property to contribute more efficaciously to this holy enterprise. Among the illustrious persons who assumed the cross were the three brothers of the king, the princes Robert, Alphonse, and Charles, Count Peter of Bretagne, and John his son Hugh, Duke of Bourgogne, William Old Dampierre, Count of Flanders, the Count of Saint Pol, and Gauthier of Chatillon, his nephew the Count of Marche, and Hugh Lebrun, his son the Counts of Dieu, of Bar, of Soissons, of Rethel, Montfort, and of Vendemy, the High Constable Imbert of Beaujean of Beaumont, Grand Chamberlain Philip of Courtenay, Archambaud of Bourbonrol of Coucy-John Desbers Gobert of Epermont, and his brothers Gilles of Mail-Y Robert of Bethune Hugh of Noailles and John, sire of Giamvier, who has written a history of this crusade. It was agreed in a general assembly of barons and prelates that all private wars should cease for 5 years, that the crusaders should be, for 3 years, exempt from all debts, and that ecclesiastic goods should be taxed 1/10 of their revenue. All that regarded the interest of the kingdom had been attended to. The king thought only of his approaching departure. A new city had arisen in the place of the small village Cuges-Morts. The port was to serve as a rendezvous for the vessels of the expedition. Magazines of corn and wine were established in the island of Chipre, where Henry of Lusignan reigned. All the cities of Italy and Sicily bestowed on the crusaders the necessary supplies. After having arranged all for the success of this enterprise, Louis convoked a parliament in which he caused the barons to swear fidelity to his children. In case he should not return from the Holy Land, then he examined carefully if he had wronged anyone, or if he had unjustly detained the property of others. The period for departure approached, and Louis prepared himself for it by the exercise of all kinds of good works. On the 12th of June, 1248, he set out with Charles and Robert his brothers to St. Denis to make his devotions. He there took the royal standard of France, the shepherds, scrip, and the other marks of his pilgrimage. He heard Mass at Notre Dame, after which he mounted his horse and left Paris in the midst of the lamentations of his people. The 2 queens were to meet him at Corbeil. In Tiacity, Louis had bestowed the regency on his mother. Beaussy was every way capable of undertaking it. Notwithstanding her eminent piety, she could not restrain her tears on bidding her son adieu. Queen Margaret protested that she would follow her spouse even to the end of the earth. Louis, finding all things prepared for departure, set sail on August 25th. The passage was pleasant as far as the island of Chypre, which had been appointed as the general rendezvous for the fleet. Here were found provisions in abundance. The intention of Louis was to proceed immediately to Egypt, but owing to the persuasion of the barons, he concluded to pass the winter at Chypre. But the change of air, bad water, luxurious living, and perhaps debauch, introduced in the army a pestilence that in a short time carried off 250 chevaliers and a number of soldiers. In this calamity we obtain an insight of the character of this saintly king. He visited and consoled the sick, giving them money or remedies, exhorted them to offer to God their sufferings, and beg him to bless this holy enterprise. His attention was without bounds. The arrival of Latin lords in an island peopled almost entirely by Greek schismatics occasioned great dissensions. The king not only appeased them but had the happiness to persuade many of them to abjure their errors. He proved himself not only a wise king but also a mediator, a zealous missionary, and a valiant warrior. But the impiety of the crusaders ceased him the most pain. These lords, naturally proud, knowledge that the war was undertaken almost solely at their own expense, obeyed only when inclined. All Louis' skill was necessary to cause them, not by force but by persuasion, to attend to their religious duties. Without forgetting that he was the sovereign, he showed himself the best and most affectionate friend of his subjects. When they had determined on proceeding to Egypt, the king, who was a strict observer of the rules of chivalry, sent information to the Sultan, who resided at Grand Cairo. The latter boldly replied that the number of assailants did not intimidate him, and that the first day of the battle would be the last for the Christians. The prince who thus expressed his sentiments was Melik Saleh, who was at that time dangerously ill. This circumstance determined their departure from Chypre. The fleet was composed of 120 large vessels and more than 1,500 small ones. Scarcely had they commenced the voyage than the wind suddenly changed, the waves of the sea became agitated, and the vessels soon dispersed. Some were cast on foreign shores, but the greater number set sail for Cape Lemisso. They soon came in sight of Damietta, which was then considered as the stronghold of Egypt. The place was defended by a belt of walls and large and deep ditches. As soon as the enemy's walls could be seen, the king assembled the principal men on deck. His noble bearing, his height, and the animation of his countenance inspired even the Monarch timid with courage and confidence. As soon as the barons were assembled round him, he addressed them the following words: "My friends, it is not without one design that God has led us in sight of the enemy, even at a time when we thought ourselves distant from them. It is his power that we see here. Do not regard me as a prince in whom the safety of church and state resides. In me you see only a man whose life, like that of all others, is but a breath that the eternal can dissipate in a moment. Let us go to this combat with confidence. If we are victorious, the Christian name will acquire a glory that will end only with the universe if we fall. We will obtain the immortal crown of martyrs. But why doubt of success? Is it not the cause of God that we sustain? Yes, without doubt. It is for us, and by us that God wishes to triumph over these barbarians. Let us commence by rendering glory to his holy name. And preparing ourselves to become his instruments inflamed by these words, the barons hastened to communicate to the soldiers the ardor that animated them, and prepared to land, notwithstanding the enemy that opposed them. The Sultan had united his best troops and a number of galleys to oppose the landing of the Christians. On one side, the sea was covered with vessels, whose pavilions, though of different colors, presented the venerated sign OT faith. On the other, the fleet of the enemy, ranged in one of the harbors of the Nile, opposed all action. A multitude of Saracens commanded by Fakardin, the best of their generals, collected on the shore and filled the air with the sound of their martial instruments. The Crusaders threw themselves in the chalices that were to convey them to the shore. The king advanced as one of these barges, accompanied by the legate of the Pope, who elevated the cross so as to encourage the combatant by its sight. The first who landed were assailed by 6,000 Saracens, but having taken the precaution to place their shields as well as lances around them, with their points turned towards the enemy, they formed a kind of rampart that the Saracens could not break. The latter, seeing the resolution of their adversaries, fled notwithstanding the superiority of their number. The bark that contained the royal standard of France had, in the meantime, landed. As soon as the king was informed of this, he cast himself, armed as he was, in the sea. His example was followed by the remainder of the chevaliers, and soon nearly the whole army was in the presence of the enemy. Each side performed prodigies of valor, but victory at length decided in favor of the Christians, and the standard of Jesus Christ was elevated before the infidel multitude. The Saracens sent dispatches to the Sultan, but from some cause they received no answer, and seized with terror they abandoned Damietta, after having sought fire to the magazines, but without destroying the bridge behind them. Louis, informed of this sudden flight, hastened to render thanks to God for so unexpected an event. A body of troops was sent to extinguish the fire and take possession of the gates of the city. Those precautions being taken, the Christians walked in procession, barefooted and bareheaded, to the Grand Mosque, which had been consecrated to the true God by John of Brienne, though Te Deum was intoned by the legate and Mass solemnly celebrated. In the midst of tears of joy shed by the assistants, who could not sufficiently thank heaven for so great a miracle, after the Crusaders had shared the booty found in Damietta, they thought of the course they should pursue. The king thought of marching immediately to Alexandria, but as several objections were brought forward by the army, he concluded to pass the summer at Damietta. By this delay the enemy were enabled to recover from their shock, and to call to their assistance the barbarians on the coast of Africa. Plays and debauches were freely indulged in by the Crusaders, and their effect was soon visible. Louis in vain endeavored to rekindle their ardor, but all was useless. The dying Sultan gave orders to the Arabs Bedouins to harass the enemy, and moreover offered them a piece of money for every Christian's head that they brought him. Favored by darkness, these bandits introduced themselves in the camp, and rarely failed in their design. The Christians found it necessary to increase the guard and preserve the strictest vigilance. The summer passed in skirmishia, but without any material advantage. The Count of Poitiers soon arrived with a considerable reinforcement. The most experienced wished to march on directly to Alexandria, but Tly soldiers insisted on laying siege to the capital of Egypt. The latter plan was agreed on, and the campaign commenced on November 20th. A large body of 5 troops remained at Damietta to defend the place. The Sultan, seeing the storm with which he was menaced, had recourse to a stratagem. 500 cavalry went by his orders among the Crusaders, and succeeded in gaining sufficient confidence to march with the troops. They profited by this, and suddenly attacked the Templars who marched before. Notwithstanding the surprise, the Chevaliers fought with so much fury as either to kill or drown all the Saracens, and not one escaped to be the bearer of the news of the defeat. The Crusaders performed so many prodigies of valor the Sultan was disposed to purchase peace at any terms. But these propositions were all rejected, however. Emlek Saleh shortly after died, leaving his crown to his Salpi, Almohadin, whom he had banished to Mesopotamia. Dr. Ring, the absence of this prince, Fakardin, a man of caught rage and prudence, had charge of the kingdom. The next object that occupied the attention of the army was the fording of the Thames. The Egyptians with their principal forces had assembled at this place, thinking that its passage could be more easily disputed as this part cf. The river was wide and deep. The king found it necessary to erect a causeway here, but as this would occupy much time, he surrounded his troops by fortifications, which sheltered them from the enemy. As soon as the Saracens perceived the design of the Crusaders, they endeavored to inconvenience them as much as possible, and often mined their works. They employed machines for throwing arrows, and so many were thrown that the heavens were literally obscured. But that which caused the greatest terror was the Grecian fire, which consumed all that it reached, and could not be extinguished by water. Whenever the king saw this fire, he prostrated himself and exclaimed, "My God, preserve me and my troops." In despair, the king assembled his full hours to show them the impossibility of crossing the river, and to propose returning to Damietta. But the high constable Imbert informed him that an Arab Bedouin had offered for a reward of 500 pieces of money to inform him where the cavalry could ford. The money was paid. The Arab and Louis drew off the plan in which his troops were to march. Count d'Artois asked to command the vanguard, but Louis, knowing his impetuous disposition, would not consent. He swore, however, that he would undertake nothing until the army had passed, and that he would await orders to proceed. Reanimated by this oath, the king permitted him to march immediately after the Templars, relying on the experience of the latter to restrain within due bounds his heroic but inconsiderate valor. The passage was gained without difficulty. 300 Saracen cavalry, posted on the opposite shore, fled when they saw the Christians conquering their territory. Count d'Artois, forgetful of prudence and his oath, pursued them. The Templars remonstrated, but an old chevalier named Foucault de Mel urged them on. He was deal and consequently ignorant of the orders of the king and the remonstrances of the Templars. Seeing the enemy flying, he exclaimed, with energy, "Now to the attack! Now to the attack!" And at the same instant the prince fell on the Saracens. The Templars hastened to his assistance, not thinking it honorable to allow him to advance alone. Fakhrddin, chief of the Mussulmans, was at this time in his bath. But on the news of the attack, he leaped, half-clothed, on one of his horses, and with a few of his followers, hastened to oppose the assailants. In the midst of the combat, he was struck by a lance and fell lifeless, while his troops, seized with terror, sought safety in flight. Everything seemed to concur to render this bold enterprise of the Count d'Artois successful. No obstacle could prevent the capital of Egypt from falling into his hands, provided he would only be prudent until the arrival of the royal army. Unfortunately, his success only increased his rashness, and, fearful of losing some of the glory of the day, he continued to pursue the Saracens, who took refuge in Missouri. This city, which was situated at a short distance from the camp, had offered some resistance, and the Templars were therefore opposed to an attack. Exhausted by fatigue, they represented to the prince how imprudent this course would be, but he would listen to nothing. All followed him, though they murmured loudly at his rashness. The barbarians, not being able to stand so terrible a shock, shut themselves up in Missouri. The Crusaders, however, interred with them and continued the pursuit. Count d'Artois, the most daring of his numbers, on the route Cairo, but seeing the impossibility of gaining any advantage, they returned to Missouri. Prudence would have dictated the closing of the gates, but instead of taking these wise precautions, those who entered last commenced pillaging the city, as though the enemy had been entirely subdued. Those who had fled, seeing that they had but a handful of men to contend with, gained courage. Bondokdar, an intrepid soldier, placed himself at the head of the Egyptians and attacked the bold adventurers. The Saracens barricaded in their houses, reanimated by this assistance, threw on the enemy all that came to hand. The Crusaders, overcome by number, soon fell under this furious attack. Many of the most illustrious personages were wounded. Count d'Artois defended himself with the courage of a lion, but exhausted by fatigue and covered with wounds, he expired in the midst of a crowd of enemies, all slain by his own hand. 300 chevaliers perished in this fatal encounter. In the meantime, Louis, ignorant of all that had passed at Missouri, had forded the Thames and ranged his troops in battle. They penetrated into the camp of the infidels, and Joinville killed, with his own hands, one of the chiefs, but on his return he and his chevaliers were assailed by a body of 6,000 cavalry. Unable to resist this superior force, the troops, already disabled by wounds, retreated in a ruined house, and there defended themselves valiantly, until the king at the head of his army advanced with trumpets and clarions. The combat undertaken with vigor. On both sides disdaining to make use of arrows or bowmen, the combatants joined and fought only with swords. Louis, impatient to take part in the glory of his companions, wished to cast himself in their midst, but a wise chevalier, Jean de Fallery, counseled him to approach the river, so as to enable him to receive assistance from the Duke of Bourgogne, who guarded the camp, and to procure refreshments for the men and horses. This counsel was approved by the barons, and was about to be executed, when the High Constable, Joubert of Biengen, came to inform the king that the Count d'Artois was in imminent danger at Massour, and in need of assistance. Constable, said the king, proceed, and I will follow. Imbert immediately set out, accompanied by Joinville with 400 armed men. Scarcely had they departed, when they were separated by a body of Saracens from the royal army. Renouncing then this first design, the two chevaliers seized a bridge over a stream, by which the infidels would have been able to have taken the king in the rear, whilst the remainder of the armed seven would have pressed him so closely he would have been compelled to retire towards Tle River. Several of his men were drowned in endeavoring to cross by swimming. Consternation reigned among the 1T Crusaders, and numbers of them had already fled. Lou is attacked, alone, a body of Egyptians. 6 Mussulmans seized the reins of his horse and prepared to make him dismount. At this critical moment his courage and strength are eased. He struck such blows around him that in a few instants his enemies were prostrated, and he found himself rescued without any aid but that of God and his own arm. During this time the constable and Joinville, who had not abandoned their posts, brought to the king Count Peter of Bretagne, who had escaped from Massour with a portion of his troop 3. As they were closely pursued, it was judged better to defend the bridge, otherwise those Saracens would take it, and the king be attacked in the front and rear. It was agreed that Soissons Peter of Noville should remain to defend this place. The Turks attempted to force a passage, but it was so well defended they were compelled to give up the design. Towards evening the High Constable returned with the archers of the king, but the enemy, on seeing this reinforcement, fled without attacking. Joinville rejoined the king, who had conquered the barbarians by whom he had been assailed. The prior of the hospital of Rane greeted the king, and asked him if he had heard lately from his brother, Count d'Artois. Yes, said the holy monarch, I know that he is in paradise. Ah, sire, replied the prior. Be comforted, for if no great advantage has yet arrived to the King of France, he will be victorious today. The king interrupted the orator by saying that God is to be praised in all things, but in speaking, tears coursed down his cheeks, which sight afflicted those around him much. In his sorrow for the loss of a brother, he did not forget the necessary precautions to prevent a surprise. Dies-Iamp was placed in a state of defense, and as they had anticipated, they were attacked by the Saracens on the following day, who were, however, repulsed with much slaughter. 8 of the infidels retired behind a breastwork, and from thence threw on the Crusaders a shower of arrows, which killed and wounded many. They awaited the night with impatience, as they wished to destroy this entrenchment. The almoner, some time after, departed, clothed with his cuirass and chapel de fer on his head and sword in hand. He marched directly to the Saracens, who, seeing him attired in this manner, took him for one of their number, but as soon as he entered the gate, he fell on them sword in hand, with so much fury that not one of the 8 dared defend himself. All retreated towards a body of cavalry which had been placed near them to render assistance. They soon attacked the intrepid almoner, but Joinville sent 50 armed men to aid him in destroying the entrenchments and removing the stones. From this day, the instigator of this exploit, whose name was John of Vaisy, who only known in the army as the brave priest of the sire of Joinville. Nothing more was done on this day, which was Ash Wednesday. The next day the king surrounded the camp by a barrier to defend it from all danger. Meanwhile, Bondoctar, who had been elected chief of the Mamelukes and general of the whole army, reported that the king of France had been slain in battle. More credit to this report, he everywhere showed the head of Tenier Courtenay Count d'Artois, his rich armor, 5-ad coat of arms embroidered with fleur-de-lis. The Fianch have no chief, said Bondoctar, their forces are subdued. Let us march against them, we will have no trouble in conquering them. The king, informed by his spies of all that passed among the enemy, disposed all for a vigorous defense. Lai divided his army into several divisions, and to the Templars gave charge of the numerous machines taken from the Saracens. Day had scarcely dawned when the Saracen general appeared with an innumerable army. He had time to make his arrangements after having acquainted himself with those of the Crusaders. The action commenced at noon. The Grecian fire, which was scattered about by means of long copper tubes, committed sad havoc. The battalion of the Count of Anjou was the first exposed to this deluge of fire and was soon routed. This prince, fallen under his horse, was exposed to the greatest danger, but the king, riding in the midst of the darts, came to the assistance of his brother and enabled him to remount. During this time, my voice and the valiant Chattelsayan and the lords of Palestine sustained the efforts of the enemy with so much bravery that the enemy could gain no advantage over them. This was not the case with the Templars. The warriors, considerably weakened by the preceding combat, were almost all cut to pieces. The machines which would have aided them had been destroyed in the commencement by the Grecian fire. The Count of Flanders, more successful, did not content himself with repulsing the enemy, but pursued them for some time and returned laden with booty. The Saracens, not daring to attack him again, threw themselves with fury on the battalion of Count de Poitiers, which, being composed entirely of infantry, was incapable of sustaining so rude a shock. They were completely routed and the Count himself taken prisoner. The valets, and even the women, animated with a supernatural courage, at the sight of so good a prince led captive by the enemy, converted into arms everything that fell within their reach, threw themselves on the Mussulman, and soon deprived them of their prize. Fus, the brother of St. Louis, owed his life in a bloody combat to the love which his mildness and beneficence had inspired his vassals. Delivered from this peril, the prince rallied his soldiers and had no difficulty, with their assistance, in vanquishing an enemy who had not been able to resist women. The last corps, under the command of Brancoux, was completely successful and repulsed the infidels, but this brave chevalier, covered with wounds, expired the same day in the arms of his son. Great advantages were gained by the Crusaders, and it was only necessary to profit by his victory. The Saracens appeared unable to undertake mother enterprise, but unfortunately the army of the King was diminished by half, owing to the combats that had rapidly succeeded each other. The return to Damietta appeared the part most conformable to prudence. This course would have been adopted if this retrograde march had not appeared like flight. A false kind of honor caused this proposition to be ejected, and by the council of the king it was decided they should remain encamped on the field of battle. This delay gave time to the new sovereign to reach Mysore with a numerous suite. His presence reanimated the courage of his troops and drew around him an innumerable crowd or warriors who did not doubt of the defeat of the French. A few days after this last battle, the corpses of Chos who had perished in the combat appeared on the surface of the water. Being in a state of putrefaction, the sun's heat rendered them still more offensive and filled the Sur with pestilential vapors. The king thought that the evil might be remedied by throwing the water off and casting on the opposite side of the bridge the corpses of the Saracens, and by making large ditches to enter honorably those Christians whom he considered martyrs of the faith. Those employed in this work were attacked with contagious diseases. The intensity of this scourge increased daily owing to the heat, the want of good water, and nourishment, which consisted almost entirely of a kind of fish called borbots, that attached themselves to the corpses and contracted the most fatal qualities. Add to the Crusaders' misfortune, the enemy found means to destroy the vessels in which the Queen, who remained at Damietta, had sent provisions to the camp of the king. This unforeseen movement cut off all communication, and hunger added its horrors TVA, the misery with which the Crusaders were almost overwhelmed. In this frightful extremity, Louis did not contradict his holy character for an instant. He visited the sick, gave them money, remedies, and above all consolation. In vain the barons represented to him the danger to which he was exposed. "I can do no less," said he, "for those who have so often exposed themselves for me," but the holy king was soon attacked and in a short time reduced to great weakness. It was decided that the army should pass in the camp of the Duke of Bourgogne so as to reach Damietta more easily. The passage was gained without much difficulty. The Kikiji had given express orders to cut the beams or the bridge as soon as the army should have passed, but by an inconceivable fatality this was not done, which occasioned the greatest misfortunes. Before commencing their journey, the council attempted a negotiation with the Sultan. It was agreed that the Saracens should give up Jerusalem, and that Damietta should be delivered to them, that the sick Christians should be placed in Damietta until they could be transported to some secure place, that all the machines of war and salt provisions should remain at this place until Thacien should send for them. This treaty concluded, they hesitated only with regard to the hostage. On the part of the French, the Counts of Anjou and Poitiers, both brothers of the king, were offered, but the Sultan declared that Aidi would receive no other hostage but the king in person. The negotiators rejected this proposition with a noble pride, while one of their brave chevaliers, Geoffroy de Sargines, exclaimed that they ought to know that the French would prefer being taken prisoners or dying before giving their king his pledge. The negotiations being broken, the king embarked on the vessels that remained to him, taking as many of the sick as he could. Several companies of archers came to escort him to Damietta. The legate and the bishop were in one of the vessels, and the army begged the king to take command of the other. Though he could scarcely sustain himself, owing to his illness, he protested that Ho could not consent to abandon so many brave people who had so generously exposed their lives in the service of God and their king, and that he would remain or die a prisoner with them. After having made known his resolution, he placed himself in the rear guard, which was always commanded by the brave Chatelain. Geoffroy of Sargines marched near him. All the other chiefs went before by the express order of the king. The languid state of Louis would not permit him to wear the heavy arms then in use. He was mounted on a harger of easy gait. He had neither cuirass nor helmet, and retained no weapon of defense, save his sword. Scarcely had the army commenced their march when the Sarasoa passed the river in great numbers in bikes and by means of the bridge, which they had neglected to destroy. They recommenced hostilities, in which the French, though languid and dejected, performed prodigies of valor, while Chatelain and his soldiers sustained themselves against the efforts of the enemy. Sargines, attentive to the danger of the king, seemed like a lion defending its yoke. Each time that he saw the Saracens approach the monarch, he seized his long sword, placed it on his shoulder, and charged with so much intrepidity that the enemy dared not approach him. The holy king, from that moment, always eulogized the brave lord, and he was pleased to say that he had never seen, in the same day, so many and so valiant exploits performed by a single chevalier. The rear guard arrived at the little village of Kassel, or Charmassac. The dying king could go no farther, and considering his weak state, no one expected to see him alive the next morning. The infidels, continuing their pursuit, found at the entrance of the village Chatelain defending alone the entrance to a narrow street that led to the house where the king was. The warrior, more terrible than ever, fell like lightning on the first who presented themselves, cast them to the ground, and attacked those who by flight hoped to avoid his blows, then returned to his post to extract from his armor and body the arrows with which he was pierced. In vain, in a voice of thunder, did he raise his war cry. Replv was Medea. The attacks were multiplied, but each time the hero made some of his enemies bite the dust. At last, overcome by numbers, pierced by 1,000 arrows, thrown by those who dare not confront his terrible arm, Chatelain fell lifeless, but covered with immortal glory as he died for the defense of his king and the honor of his religion. At the same moment, the remainder of the rear guard arrived, conducted by Philippe de Montfort. This lord, having recognized among the Saracens who pursued him the emir, with whom they had concluded a treaty some days before, hastened to inform the king and to ask permission to call some meeting. Louis had sufficient strength to declare that he consented to all that the Sultan had already exacted, and to which the barons were so strongly opposed. Montfort, having gained his consent, returned to the Saracens and caused them to present him to IE chief. The latter, being imperfectly acquainted with the distress of the French and fearing them when grown desperate, accepted with joy the propositions that he knew to be agreeable to the king. But at the moment when everything was arranged, a traitor named Marcel exclaimed, "French chevaliers, surrender. The king commands you through me. If you disobey, your life will be the forfeit." At these words, the defenders were seized with terror, fearing to expose the life of the king by longer resistance. They surrendered their arms. Thus treachery height in the disaster of the army. For the emir, who had been promptly informed of all that had passed, broke all negotiation, declaring that it was no longer necessary to treat with persons already his prisoners. The Mussulman, penetrating in the city, found the king surrounded by his followers, who, thinking that he would soon breathe his last, had assembled his brothers, the Counts of Anjou and Poitiers, and all the Christians that they could find. The sick and wounded were inhumanly massacred, excepting those of great distinction, whose followers could offer a considerable ransom. The remainder of the army soon fell into the ferocious hands of the enemy. Some reaccepted the river in galleys, hoping to escape, but 2 or 3 large vessels overcame the difficulties by which they were surrounded. The remainder were captured and burned. The Seneschal Joinville, sick and wounded, would have perished with the others, but for a precaution suggested by one of the sailors, to call himself cousin of the king, and thus saved his life. They contented themselves with making horrible menaces. Then they conducted him to Masur, where he was confined with the other barons. It was to this city they conducted the king. It was here they made him experience all the horrors of a rigorous prison. But sustained by his unalterable piety, he there appeared greater than in the most glorious circumstances of his life. His first care, on arriving at his place of destination, was to take his breviary from the hands of his chaplain and to recite his office with as much calmness as if in his own palace. Thought so weak that they were obliged to fwen him when he wished to change his position. This great prince showed a constancy so heroic that the barbarians could not conceal their admiration. He was deprived of the most needful articles of comfort, and his covering during the night consisted of an old cloak that was loaned him by a prisoner. Of all high officers and domestics, only 2 chaplains remained from whom he refused all personal service in his ambert, who had the title of Grand Cux of France, that is, Inspector of Kitchens, and all that concerned his table. The latter had the happiness of showing his master the most touching marks of fidelity. 411 that were imprisoned were allowed to choose between 2 evils, that of giving up life or renouncing their religion. Those who had the weakness to consent were placed one side, numbers suffered decapitation, and their bodies were thrown into the Nile. They were truly martyrs, happy in being found worthy to die for their religion. It would be impossible to give an idea of the frightful situation of Queen Margaret on hearing this sad news. The captivity of her spouse's death, which seemed inevitable, the impossibility of being of any assistance, the little hope they had of defending Damietta, served to increase the sorrow of this unfortunate princess. During the day she wept, and each night, tormented by terrible dreams, she imagined she saw the iron raised over the head of the king, and numbers of Saracens surrounding him. She uttered alarming cries and agitated herself in a convulsive manner. They were compelled to make an old chevalier watch near her bed and hold hands. Each time that the queen was convulsed, he exclaimed, "Lady, fear not, for I am here." One day, having caused all in her chamber to retire, with the exception of this brave old man, she cast herself on her knees and made the chevalier swear to grant her request. "Well," said she, "I beg by the faith you have will cut off my head before they seize me." The old man replied, "Be certain, madame, that I will act as you desire." The princess soon gave birth to a son named John, who, on account of the sad events that marked his birth, was named Tristan. The queen was soon informed that the guard, as well as the Pisans and the Genoese, wished to flee and abandon the king to his misfortune. She caused the principal among them to enter her chamber, and presenting them with the young prince, said, "Can you abandon a place which is the only resource of the king, and of so many brave men prisoners with him? If you wish to withdraw, at least have pity on a queen who has no hope but in you, and who only asks a week or 2 of delay." Notwithstanding her tears and supplications, she refused, and these insensible men prepared for embarkation when the queen thought she might retain them with gold. This effected what honor and compassion were unable to do, and order was soon restored. The Saracens, seeing themselves repulsed with loss, had recourse to negotiation to recover a city, which they despaired of taking by force. They endeavored to treat separately with the barons, but they replied by Pierre de Droux, old Count of Bretagne, that they had no power to do this. They then menaced them with death, and brought to them an old Saracen accompanied by a troop of warriors, armed with swords. The old man asked the captives if they believed in one, only God, born of a virgin, crucified for them, and risen the 3rd day. "Yes," replied they firmly. "Console yourself then," said the old man, "since he died for you, and has risen, he will deliver you when he sees fit." The Sultan Almohadin, finding the French lord so firm, had recourse to the king. He required from him the strongholds of Palestine, which were commanded by the Emperor Frederick, the Templars, and the Knights of St. Jean of Jerusalem. Louis replied, like his barons, that he had not the right and could not promise it. Then Almohadin, abandoned to rage, menaced his prisoner with torture. Louis, always great, always equal to himself, replied in a calm tone, "I am a prisoner of the Sultan, and he can do with me as he wills." Losing then all hope of intimidating the Holy King, Almohadin asked him how much he would give for his ransom. "Besides the surrender of Damietta, the Sultan can fix a reasonable sum," replied the king. and I will ask it of the queen. The infidels evinced astonishment at this deference shown a woman. No, said the king, she is my wife. Shortly after he was informed that Almodan required with Damietta 1,000,000 PCA gold, about 500,000 livres, but will you swear to me, said Louis to the envoy, that if the queen consents to pay this money, the Sultan will free me and my troops. The Saracens left to learn the ordera of their prince, and then return to take the oath. Now go, and tell him, replied Louis with a noble pride, that the king of France does not wish to ransom himself by money. I will restore the city for my own person and will pay the gold for the deliverance of my troops. The Sultan, astonished by the liberality of the French monarch, exclaimed that he would give 100,000 livres to aid in his ransom. A treaty was agreed on, and as soon as the articles were signed, Almodan led the king to a palace that he had constructed on the border of the Nile. These two princes met for the first time and conferred together upon the ratification of the treaty. The following Saturday was the day appointed for the surrender of Damietta, but in the interval a horrible sedition arose in the Saracen camp and changed the appearance of things. Almodan, annoyed by the increasing power of the Mamelukes, had gradually taken the employment from the principal chiefs of this formidable body and treated haughtily on the least pretext the old servitors of his house. Some excited by vengeance, others by the Fekirot, becoming victims of a disgraceful policy, leagued in secret against him. The conspiracy was conducted with so much prudence that it was not auspiciated until the moment for its execution. The how was to be struck during a repast given by Sultan to the principal officers of the army. At a signal, all fell on the unfortunate Almodan, who succeeded in escaping to one of the towers of his palace. The assassins pursued him and set fire to the tower. The Sultan escaped and cast himself into the Nile, but pierced by 1,000 arrows, he soon expired. One of the number who had procured his heart entered the tent of the king. What wilt thou give me, said he, for having delivered thee from an enemy who would have killed thee. Had he lived, Louis regarded him with horror and disdained to reply. Chose, said the barbarian, placing the point of his sword on his breast, chose either to die by my hand or bestow on me this a moment the order of chevalier. Become a Christian, replied the intrepid monarch, and I will make thee a chevalier. The Mussulman, surprised at such firmness, retired without replying. At this moment a band of these infuriated barbarians threw themselves into the galley in which the principal prisoners had embarked. When they understood that their days were numbered, they all threw themselves at the feet of a religious to confess. A Notner band of Mamelukes also entered the tent of the king, and by the most terrible gestures seemed to menace him with a cruel death. But the calmness of Louis inspired these villains with such sentiments of respect and admiration that they prostrated themselves before him, told I am that he had nothing to fear, and only demanded the execution of the treaty made with Almodan. The heroic constancy of the king made such an impression on the infidels that many of them thought of offering him the crown of Egypt, but they were restrained by the fear that he would destroy their mosque and force them to become Christians. The treaty was renewed, but the king here saw new dangers. The emirs had taken the most solemn oaths. According to the law of Mahomet, they wished the king, in case he should violate the treaty in the least respect, to be regarded in the light of a Christian who had renounced his God, his baptism, and his law, and trampled underfoot the cross. When the king heard this formula, he exclaimed that he would never take such an oath. An interpreter who had returned from the Saracens' camp assured him that the emirs were determined, if he persisted in his refusal, to behead him and his men. He replied with firmness, I prefer to die a good Christian, rather than to live in the wrath of God. And his mother, furious at such resistance, the emirs ran in crowds, saber in hand. Thou art our captive, said they to the king, and thou actest as if we were thy captives. Swear or prepare to die, you are masters of my body. Tranquilly, replied the holy king. Do with it as you wish, but my soul belongs to God, that you cannot harm. They endeavored then to conquer him by other means. The Patriarch of Jerusalem undertook to conclude the treaty. The barbarians put to him the same question in the presence of the king. He resisted, and at length succeeded in persuading them to do away with that part of the four Mila that seemed blasphemous. The Saracens now consented to the departure of the prisoners. The latter were placed in the galleys that descended the Thanis and arrived near Damietta, whilst the infidels performed the same journey by land. The king disembarked and was placed in a tent prepared for him near the river, whilst Geoffroy de Sargines retired to the city to see its surrender. The queen, the process and the ladies left as well as the remainder of the army, and immediately the Mussulman, repaired in crowds, to this place delivered up to pillage. After indulging freely in spirituous liquors, they went to the hospitals of the sick, whom they strangled. Collecting the chains and other property of the Crusaders, they set them on fire. Guided by intoxication, they resolved to massacre the Monarch and all his subjects. Already had the orders been given to the mariners to ascend towards Cairo, when the fear of drawing down the vengeance of all Europe, or rather the hope of obtaining the 8,000 gold pieces which had been promised them, changed the opinion of these villains. They gave food to the prisoners, and then permitted them to go to the king, who had remained in his tent. But when the French arrived near the prince, they found him surrounded by 20,000 armed men Saracens who conducted him towards the sea and bestowed on him as much honor as if he were their king. A generous galley awaited him near the river. At first they only noticed a single man, counterfeiting the fool, but on his whistling 80 French archers appeared, well equipped, their crossbows drawn. At this spectacle, the infidels commenced to fly like sheep, and only 2 or 3 remained with the king. The captain of the vessel then placed a plank on shore, and the king ascended, followed by Count Anjou, he a brother Geoffroy de Sargines, Philippe de Nemours, Alberic Clement, Marshal of France, the sire of Joinville, and the general of the Order of the Trinity. The counts of Flanders, of Bretagne, and of Soissons embarked at the same time in other boats, as well as the lords of France, of Chypre, and of Palestine. The Count of Poitiers remained as hostage until the king could send the 400,000 pieces of gold that he had engaged to pay before quitting Egypt. When the time for paying the sum arrived, they found that 60,000 pieces were wanting. Joinville advised the king to borrow the sum from the Templars, but the latter refused to lend and alleged that their oaths would not permit them. Then the seneschal, with the consent of the king, went on board the principal vessel of the Templars, took a hatchet, and prepared to open the CC Pfeffers, where their silver was placed. The general of the order then delivered up the keys, declaring that he yielded only to force. The money was taken, and the payment made. They believed all ended when the Count of Montfoy entered King and told the king that the Saracens had made a mistake of 20,000 pieces of gold in his favor, and that he had taken much care to prevent them from noticing it. The king, irritated by this, and wishing to give the enemy no excuse for acts of perfidy and dishonesty, sent the count at the peril of his life to restore the barbarians the 20,000 pieces that were due them. A few moments after, the king learned that the Count of Poitiers, his brother, had been set at liberty and had already embarked. He quitted his galley to sail in a large vessel which was destined for him, and gave the signal for departure. The embarkation was made with so much haste that nothing had been prepared for the king. They could scarcely find a mattress for him, which in his weak state was necessary. To amuse himself during his voyage, he called Joinville to him and made him relate all that had happened since their separation. He thought often of the Count d'Artois, his brother, and lamented his premature death. One day he inquired the occupation of the Count of Anjou, who scarcely ever approached him, though in the same vessel. He was told that this prince played with Gauthier de Nemours. He arose immediately, much vexed, and being unable to walk, had himself carried into the room where the players were seated, and threw into the sea the die tables and even the money, and reproached the Count of Anjou, saying that he had already forgotten a dear brother. After a voyage of 6 days, the fleet entered the port of Jean d'Acre, in the midst of canticles of thanksgiving. The inhabitants came in procession to meet the king, whose virtues were so much admired. Thus terminated an expedition commenced under the most happy auspices, and the result of which filled the entire world with mourning. The necessity of not interrupting the recital of the misfortunes of the Holy King does not allow us to glance over all that passed in France during his captivity. What we can form an idea of the sorrow which Queen Blanche experienced for the fate of such a son, and of the grief of the whole people, who every day trembled for the life of the best of princes and the most tender of fathers. In the midst of the universal lamentations, all felt the necessity of sending assistance to Queen Margaret, who by her stay at Damietta, in some measure held in her hand the asked resource of the king. Unfortunately, the entreaties and exhortations of Blanche had no effect on a class of people whose assistance would only be hurtful. an ambitious impostor called Jacob, an Hungarian by birth and 60 years of age, commenced to preach publicly in the country, declaiming against priests and nobles, affirming that the Bife TF Ergen had appeared to him, and had commanded him to lead to the assistance of the king. Not Chevaliers 01 warriors, but shepherds and common people, knowing that God reserves victory for the low and simple. His seeming austerity, his rustic eloquence, and tears that he shed while speaking, drew around him a crowd of partisans. All the shepherds in Flanders took the cross, and abandoned their flocks to follow the false prophet. This gave, these new crusaders the name of Pastoreaux. The troop was soon swelled by an infinite number of laborers, children, and young girls, all animated with the praiseworthy desire of liberating the holy monarch. A multitude of robbers, bandits, and excommunicated persons were in a short time added to this band. They numbered 100,000, and soon the impostor was compelled to divide them into 500 companies. 2 villains by his order commanded this army. There was no difficulty in obtaining provisions for so many, for they were abundantly supplied by the people. They passed through Amiens, where Jacob had been regarded as an envoy of God. All stopped at Paris, but on leaving the capital they pillaged the villages and even the city, massacring indiscriminately priest and laity. The inhabitants of Orleans opened the gates and ran out in crowds to listen to the sermons of the Hungarian impostor, but the murder of some ecclesiastics, committed by the disciples of this man, excited the indignation of the people, who took up arms and drove these miserable deceivers from the Ieti. He regent, having gained experience by much suffering, took such measures as would put an end to the atrocities. Ecclesiastical reproofs, judiciary power, and the strength of arms were employed to drive these brigands from the kingdom. All soon vanished. Jacob was assassinated near Bourges. His accomplices perished either by the sword or by the hand of the executioner. The Gu villagers, misled through an excess of simplicity, were spared and hastened to regain their goods, flocks, and plows. The king, after his arrival at Saint-Jean-d'Intiqueré, saw with grief the remainder of his army diminished every day by the contagion, which had greatly increased. The high constable and many other distinguished persons perished at this time. The king did not cease to attend to the sick. It mattered not of what condition they were, and even rendered them the most abject services. But in the midst of these sad occupations, he did not forget those prisoners whom he had left in Egypt. He hastened to send the 400,000 pieces of gold that were still due, with an order to his ambassadors to search with care for those unfortunate Christians that had remained in the fatal entry. Whilst the good king flattered himself with the hope of their return, his envoys, on their arrival at Cairo, experienced only cruel treatment. The Mamluks had already repented for allowing the king to leave, and to avenge themselves they heaped upon the unfortunate captives persecution and bad treatment. But some, through fear of death, had the weakness to embrace Mahometanism, but thus wetter numbers suffered martyrdom, rather than renounce the religion of their fathers. Of the 12,000 that the king had been compelled to leave, the ambassadors were only able to obtain 400. On hearing of this atrocious perfidy, Louis renounced the project that he had formed of returning to France. Not wishing to make known his resolution, he assembled the counts of Anjou and Poitiers, his brothers the Count of Flanders, and all his other barons. "The Queen, my mother," said he, "informs me that my kingdom is in great peril, and my return necessary. The people of the East tell me that Palestine is lost if I leave it, and conjure me not to abandon them to the mercy of the infidels. Beg you to give me your opinion as to what should be done. I will allow you 8 days to consider this matter." He showed no symptoms by means of which they could discover to which side he felt inclined. The 8 days having passed, the barons returned to the king, and Guy of Maivoisin, acting as spokesman, in the name of the assembly, declared those motives that ought to induce him to return immediately to his kingdom. The Count of Jaffa and the Sire of Joinville were of a different opinion. The latter spoke with so much vehemence, and painted in so touching a manner the despair of their unfortunate companions, if they were left to perpetual slavery, that he drew tears from the eyes of all. The resolution of the other chevaliers, however, was unchanged, and as Joinville was the youngest of the number, he was loaded with reproaches and bitter railleries. When the council was over, the good seneschal would have been easily chronicled for these disagreements, but he thought that he perceived a change in the conduct of the king, and this caused him much sorrow. One day, while pensively standing in the embrasure of a window, gazing on the sea before him, he felt someone behind him lean on his shoulders and hold his head between his two hands. Thinking that it was the Lord of Nemours, who sought to torment him, he said playfully, "Leave me in peace." Sir Philip then turned our head, and a hand was immediately placed over his eyes that he knew to be that of the king by an emerald, that the monarch wore. "Do not stir, Sire Joinville," said Louis, "for I wish to ask you how you could be so bold, as young as you are, to dare counsel me to remain, contrary to the opinion of all the great and wise men of France." "Sire," replied Joinville with noble candor, "in my opinion the counsel that they have given you is unwise. This is why I did not agree with them. Do you think then I would be acting wickedly if I were to return to France?" "Yes, sire." "And if I remain, will you remain also?" "Yes, sire. Even at my own expense, do not be uneasy," replied the king. "My opinion is the same as yours, but tell no one this." Just now, by this communication, Louis showed what he intended to do, and the seneschal soon resumed his gaiety, replying to the pleasant cries of his companions, without fear of lessening him, say. In the estimation of his master, assembled all the lords, and after having made the sign of the cross, invoking, at the same time, the Holy Ghost, he thanked them all for the counsel they had given, and declared his determination to return to the east. This declaration of the monarch astonished the whole assembly. Some were ashamed to leave their sovereign, while others discontinued their preparations for departure. The Counts of Anjou and Poitiers were of the latter class, but by an express order of the king, who announced that he should send them to aid and console his mother. It was on this occasion that he wrote a letter to the latter, which is still extant, in which he gives an account of his expedition to Egypt, of his captivity, and of his deliverance. Louis had given the necessary orders to collect a new army, but each placed so high a value on his own services that at the end of a month nothing had been done. The monarch, informed of the cause of this delay, arranged all to satisfy the demands of the chevaliers. He had assembled a large body of troops, when the Sultan of Damas sent to beg him to join him in an expedition against the Egyptians. In case of success, the spoils were to be equally divided. Louis replied that he could not join him unless the Egyptians continued obstinately to violate the truce concluded with them. Jean of Valenciennes was sent to learn their intentions. During his absence, the king occupied himself with adding new fortifications to those of Saint Jean d'Acre, which was the principal bulwark of the Aegean Christians in the east. To hasten the work, he himself assisted, and soon all the lords and soldiers followed his example. Whilst the king was taking these precautions, he received an embassy from the Old Man of the Mountain. "Sire," said the chief of the deputation, "do you know the Old Man of the Mountain?" "No," replied the king oldly, "but I have heard of him." "If that is the case," replied the ambassador, "I am astonished that you have not sent him presents to make him your friend. It is a duty which the Emperor of Germany, the King of Hungary, and several other great princes acquit themselves of every year, for they know that their lives are in his hands. I have come to tell you for him, not to fail to satisfy him on this point, or at least to discharge him from the tribute he is obliged to pay annually to the Grand Masters of the Art Templars and Hospitallers. He is able to defend himself from both. But his maxim is not to hazard the lives of his subjects." The king, without betraying either emotion or resentment, contented himself with coolly ordering the author of this insolent harangue to return the same evening for his reply. The two Grand Masters were present at this second conference, and the envoy repeated to them what he had said in the morning to the king. He was told to return the following day to receive the answer. The proud assassin, unaccustomed to this haughty manner, had nearly lost all patience, but he was still more astonished when the Grand Masters told him that his prince must be extremely bold to send to the king such a message. And if it were not for the respect which they entertained for the office of ambassador, they would pitch him and his companions in the depth of the sea. "We command you," added the Grand Masters, "to go to your lord, and in 15 days you may return with such letters and presents as will show that you are well disposed." The whole of Palestine trembled for the life of a prince who showed such noble pride, but the chief of the assassins, either through fear or admiration, hastened to send his own chemas and gold ring in token of the alliance he wished to form with the king. The latter sent to the Old Man of the Mountain a Dominican friar, who carried him scarlet vests and vases of gold and silver. The Sire of Valenciennes found the Egyptians disposed to do everything to avoid the anger of Louis. He returned from his mission with 200 chevaliers, whose deliverance he had effected. Louis, however, sent him back with orders to demand a complete satisfaction. That which rendered the emirs 90 tractable was the war which the Sultan of Damas was about to declare against them. He pursued them with much carnage, and each of the two parties endeavored to cause the King of France to espouse its interests. The latter, without declaring himself on either side, profited by this division. The Crusaders abundantly supplied with provisions, increased daily and fortified their places. The king visited all the cities occupied by the Christians. Thus they were prepared to combat with advantage whenever the moment might arrive. The king's army numbered only 700 chair altars and about 400 men of light infantry. Nevertheless, such was Louis' reputation for valor and wisdom, that the Egyptians sent him the prisoners that they had retained contrary to justice, and the Christian children whom they had compelled to embrace Mohammedanism. They moreover renounced all the ransom that was due them, and promised to deliver to the king the kingdom of Jerusalem, with the exception of Gaza, Daran, and 2 other chateaux. The holy monarch, satisfied with these conditions, consented to unite his troops with those of his ancient enemy. Jaffa was appointed as the rendezvous, but the Egyptians were unable to repair thither, as the passage had been intercepted by the army of the Sultan of Damas. This circumstance left the Crusaders victims to the resentment of the latter, who went as far as Jaffa, where the king had stopped according to promise. The friendship of the barbarians was of short duration. The Saracens of Damascus and those of Egypt, having become reconciled, united against the Christians. 30,000 infidels assaulted Jaffa, where the king remained with 1,400 men of arms, the remainder of the army having gone by his orders to attempt the conquest of Berlinas. Louis, hearing of the march of the enemy, retired into the castle, but not having a sufficient number of troops with him. They were attacked, massacred, and abandoned without burial. The holy king experienced such lively sorrow on perceiving this, that after the retreat of the enemy, he himself raised one of the corpses that had been exposed 4 days, and placed it in a yard that had been consecrated by the legate, saying to his followers, "Let us go to enter the martyrs of Jesus Christ." So rare an example of humility made an impression on those who were witnesses of it. Some days after, Louis heard that a vessel bearing him a considerable sum had been shipwrecked. He received this news without emotion. "Neither this loss," said he to those around him, "nor any oath will be able to separate me from the fidelity I owe my God." But this trial was not the greatest which he suffered. Death took from him a mother to whom he had always been attached, and to whose care he had been enabled to confide his kingdom during so long an absence. The legate, accompanied by the archbishops of Tyre and Geoffrey of Bouillon, brought him this sad intelligence. Louis, seeing by the countenance of the prelate that he had some sad communication to make, led him into the chapel and begged him to speak. The latter commenced by reminding the monarch of the great obligation he was under to God for having been so piously raised by the best of mothers, and in having found in her so wise and prudent a guide for the government of his kingdom. Then, in a voice broken by sighs, he exclaimed, "This illustrious queen is no more. Death has removed her from us." The king at this announcement uttered a groan and shed a torrent of tears, but soon regaining his composure, he cast himself on his knee before the altar, and joining his hands said, "Thank you, O my God, for having preserved you till now, a mother so worthy of my affection. It was a gift from your mercy, and you have only recalled what belonged to you. I cannot complain, it is true, that I loved her tenderly, but since it has pleased you to take her from me, may Yom Hoy name be forever blessed." After these words he desired to remain alone with his confessor. When the prelates had retired, he knelt again at the foot of the crucifix, and for some time remained absorbed in profound meditation. Then rising, he passed into his oratory, and there recited, with the good religious, the office of the dead. From this time he never omitted each day, having a low Massachusetts said, "For the repose of the soul of his mother, except on Sundays and great festivals." Louis now thought seriously of returning to France. The situation of affairs in this kingdom rendered the return of the monarch necessary. His resolution, however, was not formed until he had not only consulted his chevaliers, but also the lords in Palestine. All unanimously advised him to leave. The departure being resolved on, Joinville, by the order of the king, conducted the queen and the 3 young princes that had borne during this crusade to Tyre. They were soon joined by the monarch, and all proceeded to St. Jean d'Acre, which had been appointed as the general rendezvous. 100 chevaliers remained under the command of the brave Sargines, who defended himself for 3 years against the attacks of the Saracens. On St. Mark's Day all set sail for France. During the feuillage, the king's most agreeable occupation was to attend to the exercises of religion, to visit the sick, and instruct the sailors. He questioned them on articles of faith, and constantly reminded them that, being by their occupation between life and death, the care of their salvation should be their only thought. Have recourse He often said to them, "Without delay tien the sacrament of penance. If you are required about the ship, I, with pleasure, will take your place, and perform the labor while you reconcile yourselves to God." His example and exhortations were crowned with success. While sailing towards a country, the remembrance of which filled the hearts of the crusaders with such pleasant emotions, the vessel of the king was violently hurled against a sandbank in the latitude of the island of Chipre. A second shock, no less severe, spread terror among the sailors and troops. Only sighs and groanings were heard, for each believed that his last hour had arrived. The queen in consternation clasped her children to her bosom and endeavored to appease the cries of these little innocents. The first movement of the king was to prostrate himself before him who commands the tempests, ought implore mercy for so many unfortunate beings exposed to such great peril. No sooner had he finished his prayer than the vessel was liberated, and on examination it was found that THS Bank had prevented them from striking against a rock. The following day the king examined the vessel aid, was told by the nautical master that it won't be unsafe him to remain on board, and begged him to abandon TM vessel. "Tell me," said Louis, "by the faith and loyalty you owe me, if this vessel belonged to you and was loaded with rich merchandise, would you leave it? If it were in the same condition?" Vino replied, they all unanimously, "Nine. We would prefer to risk all, rather than suffer so considerable a loss." "Why then would you have me leave it?" "Because," replied the mariners, "no treasure in the world is so precious as the life of your majesty, but do you not know that each one here values his life as much as I do mine? If I were to abandon the vessel, they would also wish to leave it, and as there are not sufficient boats to receive them, they would be compelled to remain in a foreign land, without the least hope of returning to their country. Rather than cause so much misery to more than 100 loyal followers who have been of great assistance to me in the Holy Land, I will risk all, and place my life, as well as that of the Queen and our 3 children, in the hands of God." By this heroic act, Louis saved the lives of many unfortunate beings, for Oliver of Termes, celebrated for his intrepid courage in combats, not being able to overcome his fear of drowning, embarked to the island of Chipre and was there detained nearly 2 years. This accident was not the only one that occurred during the passage. A furious wind assailed the fleet before it had quite passed the island of Chipre, but Providence preserved the lives of the king and his followers. After a long and tiresome voyage, the fleet arrived at the islands of Hyères in Provence. The king was so weak that the Seneschal of Champagne was obliged to lift him from the vessel. Orders were given to collect immediately horses for the king and his suite. The return of the monarch to his capital enabled the Parisians to display their love for his august person. Fêtes succeeded each other for several weeks, without interruption. They could not deny themselves the pleasure of fleeing a prince so tenderly loved. Louis now applied himself to correct the abuses occasioned by his absence. His first care was to publish an ordinance on the administration of justice. The wisest measures were taken to prevent the corruption of judges and to secure the rights of the weak, as well as those of the rich and powerful. This ordinance was followed by others concerning the Jews and gambling houses. It was principally the morals that it was necessary to reform, for the Holy King could not forget the precept that if the body is not pure, neither can the soul be. An object no less important was the election of the council. Louis admitted none but able, distinguished men, worthy the confidence of a king whose only care was the happiness of his subjects. However friendly he might have been to any of his followers, he granted no request until he had long deliberated and consulted the council, to be sure that there was nothing in the demand contrary to justice. A custom had been introduced by his predecessor to send from time to time in the provinces persons commissioned to receive the complaints of the people. He had practiced it before bit voyage across the sea. On his return, he did not think this precaution sufficient, and as G had to pass through the south of France, he determined to visit the southern provinces. He departed to Picardy, and from thence to Flanders, where he appeased the difficulties relative to the succession of Count William. He then returned to Paris to receive and welcome the King of England, who had asked permission to pass through his land. The first interview between the 2 kings took place at Chartres. They then took the road to Paris. The people met them in great pomp, some bearing arms, others bows in token of peace. They were warmly welcomed by the members of the university. Each member was clothed with his dress of ceremony, carrying a lighted wax taper, and a cravat of flowers. The day ended by illumination and other marks of joy. Immediately after the departure of the King of England, Louis occupied himself with the marriage of his daughter Isabel with Thibaut V, King of Navarre and Count of Champagne. He did not wish to conclude Tia Liano until Thibaut had satisfied his sister, the Countess of Bretagne, who had lawful claims to the crown of Vannes. The affair was at length arranged by an indemnity and money. The king, seeing nothing contrary to justice, consented to an union, so much desired by the young prince. The same spirit of integrity caused him to repress severely the abuses that were committed by some noble men. Their castles were taken and razed, and tranquility, Wathree soon restored even in the most distant provinces. By wise firmness, Louis acquired each day new claims to the love of his subjects. The oppressed found in him a certain support. He kept near him a number of confidential persons, such as the sires of Nesle, of Joinville, and the Counts of Soissons, Peter of Fontaines, and Geoffroy of Villette, bailiff of Tours, so as to be enlightened by their opinion. His attention to public and private affairs did not prevent him from redoubling his fervor in the practice of religion. Fasting and prayer were his most familiar exercises. Every laity fed in his house 120 persons. This number was often increased to 200. Frequently, he allowed none to serve them but himself. He washed their feet, ate with them, and never sent them away without giving them money. Before, it had been the custom to distribute every Lent 1,119 livres, 63 hogsheads of corn, and 68,000 herrings to the poor monasteries and hospitals. For fear that this custom would be abandoned, he rendered it fixed and immovable by patent letters, which would oblige his successors to observe it. He endeavored to diminish the uxie that prefeed on the people, to relieve the want mempi infidelis, whom he had led to the Catholic faith, and fine, to support religious communities, and to found abbeys and hospitals. Those of Royaumont, of Longchamp, of Maubuisson, and Lies owe their birth to him. Nunneries were established by his orders in a number of cities. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris was considerably enlarged by his exertions, but of all the establishments, the most praiseworthy, perhaps, was the famous hospital for the blind. In the midst of so many useful occupations, Louis maintained pique, which allowed him to strengthen those institutions which were most beneficial and contributed most to the happiness of his subjects. Strongly convinced that the maintenance of union among the powerful, when it can be allied honorably with the crown, is of the greatest benefit, he thought only of rendering secure the tottering relation that existed between England and France, which resembled more a suspension of arms than peace. A treaty was concluded between the two kings, in which, by the cession of some places in the south, Louis obtained a forma renunciation of the rights that the King of England pretended to have over Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Poitou. Henry, besides, was to render in person ordinary homage. The inhabitants of Guyenne and the ceded provinces acknowledged themselves as liegemen of the king, and, in consequence, swore faith and loyalty as to their lord. The conditions were at length ratified by these TTC monarchs on the occasion of a visit of the English K.O. Paris. He was received, if possible, with more magnificence than in his former visit. After a month's sojourn in Paris, Henry prepared to return to his dominions, when the premature death of the eldest of the young French princes plunged not only the court and capital, but the whole kingdom in mourning. Arrived at the age of 16, this worthy son of Louis had displayed those beautiful qualities which he owed partly to birth, partly to education. The beauty of his soul corresponded to that of his figure. Louis had often impressed upon him the great obligations that God imposes on those who are charged with the government of his people. The young prince, raised with such sentiments, would no doubt have made a great king. He died a perfect Christian, and showed to the last the most profound piety. The King of England, who assisted at his burial, wished to carry the coffin, and at his example, the highest barons, English as well as French, rendered the same office to the deceased. We can easily imagine how sensible Louis was to this proof of friendship and respect that King Henry gave. Louis retained King Henry at his court until the feast of Easter, when they separated. Louis now made another visit through his kingdom. Anno established the famous ordinance against judiciary duels and substituted proof by witness. Before, when two noble men disagreed on a matter which presented some doubts, he who gave the challenge could oblige his adversary to accept. If Ho declined, he lost Niai's cause. If one fell, he was considered as guilty of the fault imputed him in the following year 1262. An invasion of Tartars in Syria and Palestine excited the solicitude of Louis for in 3 of these countries. He assembled the barons, and by public prayer, fasting, and processions, endeavored to appease the wrath of God. Blasphemies were punished. Tournaments and gambling prohibited. A considerable sum of money was sent to Sargines, by means of which he was enabled to sustain himself against the Tartars. Reassured by these precautions, the king applied himself to state affairs. Some had the boldness to say to him that he spent too much time in devotional exercises. "Men are strange," replied he with mildness. "My assiduity to prayer they convert into a crime, and yet they would not say a Rode Eli spent the same time in hunting fallow deer or chasing herds." He, above all, endeavored to perfect the police and encourage commerce. Then he founded his Society for Arts and Trades, the loss of whose rules is even now a subject of regret. Public roads and interior navigation were much benefited by his exertion. In fine, France became so happy under the conduct of this holy king that multitudes of strangers flocked there to enjoy three things found nowhere else: ease, justice, and peace. The King of England soon gave a convincing proof of the confidence that he placed in the virtues of Louis. The barons of this country, discontented at the prodigality of the king, compelled him to adhere to degrading conde coups, which, far from remedying, increased the disorders of the government, and placed all authority under the hands of ambitious and turbulent lords. This contract, to which King Henry had been obliged to yield, was broken as soon as he could take measures to resist the rebellion. The lords armed themselves in their turn, and were joined by the populace. Civil war seemed inevitable, when the more sensible of the two parties proposed to submit it to the King of France and act as he should order. Louis having accepted this delicate mission, the assembly was held in the city of Amiens. The English monarch appeared in person, and the barons appointed their deputies. After the respective rights of the two parties had been discussed, the august judge gave his decision in the following manner: "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, we annul and break all the statutes in the Parliament of Oxford, as innovations, prejudicial, and injurious to the dignity of the throne. We discharge the king and barons item the obligation of observing them. We declare all that has been ordered in consequence to be null, and of no value we revoke, and repress all the letters that the king may have written on this subject. We order that all the fortresses that have been placed at the disposal of the 80 the council opposed to the King of England shall be given up to his disposition. We desire that he act in all great affairs of the state, that he grant forgiveness to all, and that he call indifferently to his councils all those whose merits and fidelity are known to him. We order and decree that all the legitimate rights possessed by his predecessor be restored to him, and that both parties forget the past. VV do not wish, however, to derogate from the privileges, charters, and liberties which were in use before the dispute was commenced. These wise resolutions would have secured the tranquility of St. England if they had been observed, but some one of the barons, wishing to do away with them, hostilities recommenced. The king was taken in battle, and ransomed a short time after by his son, but did not recover his entire power, until the death of the Count of Leicester, who was at the head of the rebellion and the soul of his party. About this time the Pope offered to Louis the crown of Sicily for one of his sons, but the wise monarch remained faithful to his principles of neutrality and refused the brilliant offer. The Count of Anjou was not possessed of the same prudence as his august brother. In the midst of the numberless benefits that Louis had inferred on his people, he was filled with regret at the ill success of his Egyptian and Syrian expedition. The glory of the French name seemed to him almost to have faded away in these countries, and the interests of religion had gained nothing by the great sacrifices of men and money. His constitution no longer allowed him to combat as a soldier, neither could he sustain the heavy armor, use at that time, be it his kingdom was filled with a proud nobility, desirous of honor, and too long a peace had kept them in such a state of inaction as might have become fatal to the state. A campaign against the enemy of the faith, under such circumstances, could not but be successful. Louis would not decide, however, until he had written to the Pope, who at first endeavored to dissuade him from exposing himself to fatigue above his actual strength, but seeing the king persisted in a resolution that seemed inspired by heaven, Clement IV pressed him to hasten the accomplishment of his design. Palestine had never stood in greater need of assistance. D-Man at this time. Sargines remained immovable before attacks of barbarians, who from the depths of Asia, on his little troop in the east, the divisions of the Christians themselves, and above all, those of the Templars and Hospitallers, the infidelity of the members of the two orders, in the execution of treaties, succeeded in drawing on them, an implacable enemy in the person of Bondakdar, who from the first expedition of St. Louis had been a famous character and who had become sovereign of Egypt, of Damascus, of Aleppo, and the greater part of Arabia by the assassination of the Sultan, his master. By a truce concluded between the Christians of Palestine and the people of Egypt, they had agreed to deliver up all the prisoners on both sides. Sargines executed the treaty and endeavored to make the Templars conform to it, but the latter, led on by detestable avarice, refused to deliver those Saracens that they held in bondage. The proud Mussulman, irritated by this violation of the treaty, assembled 300,000 horsemen, placed himself at their head, and carried terror and desolation in the heart of Palestine. The city of Nazareth was completely ruined. Caesarea, that Louis had fortified with so much care, fell after an assault. Caiphas and Arsuf also submitted to the yoke of the conqueror. The house for pilgrims and that of Montfort were more fortunate in their resistance, but the Saracens, rendered furious, eased themselves upon Saphir, which was compelled to surrender. The inhabitants were inhumanly strangled. The enemy carried their barbarity so far as to flay alive 2 Grey Friars who were among the prisoners. After this atrocious act, Bondakdar presented himself before St. Jean d'Acre, whose environs he had devastated, and threatened to lay siege to it, soon as his warlike machines should arrive. Such was the substance of the new received from the EEs. All thought it necessary that assistance should be sent to these holy places, but none were willing to offer their services. Louis, yielding to the generous impulses of his heart, publicly announced from his throne that he was resolved to carry aid to his brothers in Palestine, who were menaced by the Saracens with the most cruel slavery. The picture that he drew of their condition was so touching that numbers of the Lords solicited the favor of receiving the Holy Cross from the hands of the Cardinal of St. Cecile, legate of the Holy See. Joinville was almost the only one among the distinguished chevaliers who refused to take a part in the new crusade. He gave as a reason that during his first voyage beyond the sea, his vassals had been annoyed and impoverished, that, in the absence of their lord, their ruin would be completely effected, and that he was not doing the will of God if he exposed their lives and property, instead of remaining to aid and defend them. All solicitations were useless, and the good seneschal sacrificed the sincere attachment that he felt for the king, for that which he considered di.ty. After having provided for the government of the state by the nomination of 2 regents, who were the abbot of St. Denis and the sire of Nesle, and fixed the portion of each child, and made his last will, Louis went according to custom to take the royal standard at St. Denis, and then commenced his journey. Ain Mortiz had been appointed as the general rendezvous for the Crusaders. The vessels that were to bring the Genoese had not yet arrived. Troubles arose between men of different nations, on account of remaining a state of inaction. The presence of the king was necessary to put an end to their bloody quarrels, but embarkation, which alone could have effectually prevented them, was impossible. Louis received an embassy from the Emperor of Constantinople. This prince, alarmed at the preparations made in France for war, and fearing that they were secretly directed against him, proposed to the King of France to employ him to effect the reunion between the Greek and Latin churches. Such an offer filled the heart of Louis with joy, but knowing that it did not belong to him to decide in matters of faith, he made known the proposal of the Emperor to act as mediator to the Holy See. The ambassadors returned to their country having gained nothing. The Genoa arrived, and the army embarked. Before setting sail, the king held a council to decide on the place of destination. Tunis was chosen. He was induced to repair thither by a promise that the king of this place had made him of embracing Christianity if he could do so without being put to death by his subjects. As an excuse for the appearance of the royal army, it was necessary for it to seem as if they had been compelled to land by some superior power. If the Mahometan prince were sincere in his profession, the expedition could not but be successful. If the contrary, they would attack the capital, which, it was said, could not long resist. Flattered by this agreeable illusion, the Crusaders Senil for Sard, Benin, where the King of Navarre, the Counts of Poitiers, and Flanders were to join them. The first part of the passage was disagreeable. Violent wind dispersed the fleet, and it was after 8 fearful days that they entered the port of Cagliari. Water was wanting, which the islandera furnished, but they refused to allow the sick who were in need of refreshments to land. They afterwards yielded through fear. The 3rd day after they set sail, they arrived at Tiacheatres entrance of the Gulf of Tunis. On seeing the fleet, Those of the inhabitants who were on the shore fled towards the mountains, abandoning their barks, which the Crusaders seized. Florent Varennes landed without opposition and sent word to the king that he must join him without lose of time in order to profit by the fright which prevented the barbarians from making any opposition. But Louis, acquainted with the usual impetuosity of Varennes, paid no attention to this bold request and judged it better to wait until the next day. Varennes was recalled, and the following day the descent was made. The wisdom of this determination was soon made manifest, for at the break of day the port and all the environs were covered with an innumerable number of Saracens. This spectacle did not diminish the courage of the war Rioi. They landed, saber in hand, and prepared themselves to tall upon the enemy. But the latter had fled, and in a few momenta thieves were masters of the isthmus. WMCAT Beve occupied themselves in raising tents, but unfortunately they were unable to obtain the most necessary articles. The want of water caused the Christians to suffer extremely, for the greater number of them were unaccustomed to the burning air of Africa. The next day they discovered some cistern being near a large tower, which were guarded by Saracens. The first who imprudently advanced to satisfy their thirst were surprised, and nearly all killed. The king sent to their assistance some troops, who had but little difficulty in seizing the tower. They kept it in possession as long as there was any water in the cisterns, but as soon as they were exhausted, there was nothing left but to march towards Carthage to await the king of Sicily, to whom Louis had made a promise of undertaking nothing until his arrival. This city was not fortified, but was furnished with a strong castle, which the Mahometans seemed determined to defend. The king having given the necessary orders to lay siege to the castle, the mariners offered to hasten the operation, provided they would give them a certain number of crossbow men. The offer being accepted, these Bra-E men advanced, placed their ladders against the walls of the fort, ascended with the rapidity of lightning, hoisted the royal standard, and opened a passage for the soldiers, who followed in a few minutes, and made themselves masters of the castle. During the glorious action, the Saracens had appeared in arms on the heights, but the presence of the army that Louis had ranged in battle prevented them from endeavoring to oppose the taking of a city, which they regarded as the key of the country. Carthage was taken, but their all conquest ended. The first care of the king after this advantage was to free the city from corpses, and to establish hospitals for the sick. The princesses were placed there by his orders. These were the wives of the 3 sons of France, the Counts of Poitiers, of Artois, and the Queen of Navarre, the King of Tunis. Instead of demanding baptism he had promised, was much irritated by the attack of the French. He endeavored to weaken the forces of the king by continual skirmishes which cost the lives of many, but were of no decided result. The Counts of Navarre, second son of the king, was one of the first victims of the scourge that was now desolating the camp. His brother, Prince Philip, and the King of Navarre were attacked with the contagion, but were fortunate enough to recover. Soon the Cardinal Legato, the Counts of Vendôme, Marche, Gauthier, and Nemours, with a number of other lords, perished miserably, regretting that they had not seen the triumph of their arms. At length the king was attacked. It was in his last moments that he displayed a greatness of soul superior to all that had been seen before. He gave his orders, foresaw the wants of others, and endeavored to redress their wrongs, but soon his strength failed, and he was unable to leave his bed. Louis, though incapable of acting, was none the less animated by the desire of being useful to his subjects. It was for them principally that with a trembling hand betrayed this admirable advice. My son, the first thing that I recommend is to love thy God with all thy heart, and to desire rather to suffer than to commit one single mortal sin. If God sends thee adversity, submit with resignation, and know that thou hast offended. And this punishment will be profitable to thee. If he sheds on thee his benefits, thank him humbly, so that thou mayest be puffed up by pride. Have recourse to the sacrament of penance, and be earful to choose a wise confessor. Be so humble that thy confessor and friends will not fear to reprimand thee. Listen attentively and with piety to the service of the Holy Church, and particularly to the Mass before thy coronation. Shem. Have a mild and compassionate heart for the poor and unfortunate. Relieve and aid them to the best of thy ability. Support the good customs of thy kingdom, and do away with the evil ones. Seek not to enrich thyself at the expense of thy people. Do not load them with excessive taxes. If thou feelst any secret sorrow, confide it to thy confessor or some prudent friend, whose sentiments will not end in vain words. Thy affliction will thus be lightened. Let those by whom thou art surrounded be wise and loyal men of good morals and great probity. Above all, avoid the company of the wicked. Listen to the word of God, and retain it in thy heart. Pray often, and with sincerity. Encourage good and repress evil. Allow no persons to discourse on subjects that aim to sin, neither permit any to slander the absent, much less allow them to speak of God with irreverence. Return thanks frequently to thy Creator for the gifts he has bestowed on thee, and thus thou wilt prepare thyself for new ones. Be firm and loyal in the justice that thou owest thy subjects, and turn not from the right course for any consideration whatever. Aid the just cause and assist the poor in their contentions, that is, if truth be on their side. If anyone brings an action against thee, take no part until thou knowest exactly what it is. By this means the counselors will be enabled to judge more boldly, according to truth, either for or against thee. If thou hast anything that belongs to others, restore it without delay. If it is doubtful, have it promptly examined by wise and industrious persons. Thou shouldst endeavor to make all under thy government live in peace and uprightness. Concerning the cities of thy kingdom and thy customs, keep them as thy predecessors left them, but if abuses enter, correct them with care. So be to draw to thee the hearts of the inhabitants by love and kindness. Love and honor all persons who belong to the church, and see that they are not deprived of the gifts and alma which they received from thy predecessors. Confer not ecclesiastical benefits, but on those of a pure life and irreproachable morals. Never engage in war against Christians unless compelled to do so, and if thou wilt not avoid it, at least spare those who take no part in the contention. If thy subjects wish to war among themselves, appease them as soon as possible. Be scrupulous in the choice of thy officers of justice, and often inquire concerning their conduct. Endeavor to put an end to blasphemy and heresy in thy kingdom. Be careful that the expenses of thy house are not excessive. In fine, my dear child, I desire that throughout the kingdom thou shalt have masses celebrated for the repotum of my soul. My dear child, give all the benedictions that our affectionate Father can give his Son. May the Holy Trinity and all the saints guard, and defend thee from evil, and may God give thee grace in all things to do his will and to honor him, so that we are both after this mortal life be with him. You praise and bless him for all eternity. Amen. A few moments after Louis had ended this discourse, the violence of his disease sensibly increased, and feeling that his strength was failing, he asked for the Holy Viaticum, which he received kneeling. He no longer occupied himself with worldly affairs, but made the most tender wishes for the conversion of infidels. His soul, ready to wing its flight to celestial regions, called on God and claimed the intercession of the saints. Shias owed his approaching dissolution. He was placed, by his own orders, on a bed covered with ashes, and then with eyes turned towards heaven, his arms crossed, and a countenance impressed with an angelic serenity. He expired on Thursday, 25th of August, 1270. Whilst distinctly pronouncing these beautiful words of the royal prophet, Lord, I will enter into your house, I will adore in your holy temple, and I will glorify you I name. Such was the truly Christian death of Louis IX. He expired in the 56th year of his age, and the 45th of his reign. His memory has been revered in all ages as the most just and virtuous prince that ever wore a crown. Charles of Anjou soon after arrived with his troops to reinforce the army of the king. Astonished that no one came to greet him, and fearing some misfortune, he advanced for his warriors, passed the camp, and reached the tent of his virtuous brother, whom he found extended on his bier. He prostrated himself, uttering mournful cries, and kissed with transport the feet of the holy king, and showed the very mark of violent despair. His remains were placed in a case to be carried to France and given to the Abbey of St. Denis, but at the moment when these precious remains were to be placed in the vessel for transportation, the whole army protested they would not give up a treasure which was the safety of all, and the pledge of victory. Acceded to their wishes, and the holy relics remained in the camp. Several successive advantages gained by the Christians led the king of the Saracens to solicit peace. As soon as the treaty was concluded, they disnosed everything for the transportation of the holy relics of the king. After having passed through Pailly, Philip returned to France, where new scenes of sorrow awaited him. He was followed by an immense crowd, and sighs and sobs were heard mingled with the praises of the saint, for whom all France wept. The religious ceremonies ended at St. Denis. The remains of the king were placed in a sarcophagus, ornamented with gold and silver leaves. covered with an art superior to all that had then been seen. 1271 The Church proclaimed that the model of kings had entered into eternal GLNRE mid that Catholics should honor him as a saint.